It began with silence, not the kind that calms you, but the kind that follows after something unthinkable. A train stands still in the cold dawn, its doors locked from the outside. Inside, hundreds of people press together, gasping for air, clutching photographs, children, prayers that won't be answered. No one knows where they are going, but everyone feels where this road leads. The snow outside hides the tracks of millions, and yet every whisper of wind still carries their names. This wasn't a war crime born overnight. It was an idea, carefully fed, normalized, and sharpened until words became laws and laws became death. Before the world called it the Holocaust, it was just neighbors turning away, teachers obeying orders, and ordinary people convincing themselves that silence was safer than truth. But behind every uniform, every train schedule, every typed list, were choices. And those choices built the most efficient machine of death in human history. This is not just the story of genocide. It's the story of how humanity stood on the edge of a mirror and watched itself disappear. Chapter 1. The Seeds of Hatred. It began long before the gas chambers, before the barbed wire, before the trains, before the world learned a word that would come to define human evil. It began in whispers, in sermons, in streets, in classrooms. 1,000 years before Hitler was even born, a poison was already dripping slowly into the bloodstream of Europe. A poison called hate. Imagine a candlelit cathedral in the 13th century. The smell of incense hangs in the air. A priest raises his voice and declares that the Jews killed Christ. In the pews, people bow their heads, some in faith, others in quiet unease. Outside, a Jewish merchant closes his shop early, sensing the storm that always follows holy words twisted by men. Stones strike his windows that night. A rumor becomes a riot, and Europe takes another small step toward Auschwitz. For centuries, Jews were forced to live in separate quarters called ghettos, walled in, marked, and watched. They were blamed for plagues they didn't cause, accused of poisoning wells, and charged with crimes that existed only in fear. Medieval paintings showed them with hooked noses and horns, feeding a myth that they weren't quite human. When kings needed money, Jews were tolerated. When debts needed canceling, they were expelled. From England in 1290, from France, from Spain, from one land after another. Their history was a long migration through hatred's map. By the time the Enlightenment came, bringing talk of liberty and reason, antisemitism didn't vanish. It simply learned to wear a new mask. The language of religion gave way to the language of science, or something that pretended to be science. In the late 19th century, men with titles and universities behind their names began classifying humanity into races, assigning worth with measuring tapes and skulls. The Jews, they said, were not a people of faith anymore. They were a biological problem. It was no longer about souls. It was about blood. This new racism felt modern, rational, even respectable. It claimed proof, data, charts, and skull shapes. In cities like Vienna, Paris, and Berlin, salons and newspapers discussed eugenics the way one might discuss art or philosophy. They believed humanity could be improved like breeding horses, by removing what they saw as weak or impure stock. The Jews, for centuries scapegoated as outsiders, now found themselves labeled as a genetic threat, a race that could not change, could not convert, could not belong. Out of this new language of race rose men like Houston Stewart Chamberlain, a British-born writer who adored German culture. His book, The Foundations of the 19th Century, declared that the Aryan race was the source of all civilization and that Jews were its eternal destroyers. His words dripped into the ears of nationalists and dreamers looking for someone to blame for a changing world. Even Germany's famous composer, Richard Wagner, turned music into ideology, calling Jewish artists parasites on German art. These were not raving fanatics in back alleys. They were the intellectuals, the cultural elite, giving prejudice an academic gloss. And then came a document that would ignite paranoia across continents. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion. A forgery born in the dark offices of Tsarist Russia's secret police, it claimed to reveal minutes of a secret Jewish meeting to control the world. Banks, newspapers, governments, all supposedly under Jewish command. It was pure fiction, plagiarized from earlier political satire. But the lie was perfect because it confirmed what millions already wanted to believe. When the protocol spread through Europe, they didn't just sell books, they sold enemies. In coffee houses and parliament halls, in factories and churches, men began to whisper that every misfortune had a single architect. Economic collapse, the Jews. Political chaos, the Jews. Cultural decay, the Jews again. It didn't matter that Jewish communities were as divided, as ordinary, as human as anyone else. In the mind of the crowd, they had become a single, faceless shadow, a ghost enemy that could justify anything. As the 20th century dawned, Europe was transforming. Machines replaced horses, factories replaced farms, and old empires trembled under new ideas. The world was modernizing, but fear never ages. In Vienna, a young failed artist named Adolf Hitler wandered the streets, broke and angry, watching people he envied pass by, the educated, the wealthy, the cosmopolitan. Among them were Jews. In the city's cafes, he absorbed the venom of men like Karl Lueger, the mayor who turned antisemitism into political theater. Lueger smiled as he blamed Jews for every hardship, wrapping hatred in patriotism. Hitler was listening. When the Great War erupted in 1914, nationalism turned into worship of flags and death. Millions died, and Germany emerged broken, humiliated, starved by reparations and resentment. In the ruins of empire, conspiracy thrived. Soldiers returning from the front found no victory parade, only poverty and chaos. Someone had to be responsible for the defeat. And once again, the Jews were accused of stabbing the nation in the back. The stab-in-the-back myth became a rallying cry for those who could not accept that the war was lost by strategy and exhaustion, not betrayal. Hitler, now a veteran with medals and fury, discovered his purpose. The army sent him to observe radical political groups. He found one, the German Workers' Party, and found in it a language that matched the voices that had haunted Europe for centuries. He joined, then led, then transformed it into the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazis. Their message was simple, brutal, and familiar. Germany's suffering was not her fault. It was theirs, the foreigners, the traitors, the Jews. Behind the slogans were centuries of groundwork. Every pogrom, every sermon, every lie had built the foundation he stood on. Hitler didn't invent hatred, he industrialized it. He gave it uniforms, banners, and marches. He took ancient prejudice and turned it into policy, pseudoscience, and destiny. The old religious accusations became racial decrees. The word Jew stopped meaning a person. It became a symbol of everything wrong with the world. To understand how this could happen, one must step into the mind of Europe at that time. It was an age obsessed with purity and order. Everything was categorized, measured, ranked. Scientists like Gobineau and later Alfred Rosenberg wrote of racial hierarchies as though they were natural law. The so-called Aryan was at the top, strong, noble, destined to rule. The Jew was at the bottom, cunning, deceitful, corrosive. It was not a debate anymore. It was doctrine. In schools, children were taught to see difference as danger. In newspapers, caricatures turned human beings into vermin. In political rallies, loudspeakers replaced conscience. But hatred isn't just shouted. It's built brick by brick through small decisions that no one questions. A newspaper headline, a teacher's silence, a friend's shrug. By the 1920s, anti-Semitism was no longer fringe. It was fashionable. Even countries outside Germany embraced it. In Poland, pogroms still flared. In France, the Dreyfus Affair had already shown how fragile justice became when prejudice held the pen. And across the Atlantic, Henry Ford published The International Jew, spreading the protocols to millions of readers who saw themselves as civilized, modern, and Christian. As this tide rose, the idea of a Jewish problem became political currency. The Nazis simply cashed it in. Their speeches promised rebirth. Their rallies promised unity. But their scapegoat was always the same. They painted Jews as the invisible hand behind communism, capitalism, liberalism, whatever frightened the crowd most that week. Fear was their fuel. And Europe, exhausted by depression and disillusion, was ready to burn anything to feel strong again. Still, not everyone believed. Some saw the danger, but their voices were drowned out by the roar of crowds demanding someone to blame. Jewish citizens who had fought for Germany in the Great War watched with disbelief as their loyalty was erased overnight. Professors, musicians, doctors, suddenly strangers in their own country. But the shift was subtle at first. Just words. Just boycotts. Just signs in shop windows. Just laws. Each just made the next step easier. By the time Hitler wrote Mein Kampf in prison after his failed coup, the blueprint was already clear. The Jews, he wrote, were the bacillus infecting nations, the eternal enemy. He fused centuries of Christian and racial antisemitism into a single deadly ideology. And like any infection, it would require cleansing. The metaphor wasn't accidental. It was preparation. Outside Germany, the world barely noticed. Or perhaps it didn't want to notice. Many dismissed Hitler's words as ranting, his hatred as rhetoric. After all, Europe had survived hate before. But this time was different. This time, hate had modern tools, printing presses, radio stations, mass rallies, the machinery of a state. It had uniforms, flags, and songs. It could spread faster than ever, carried not by torchlight, but by microphones. The late 1920s brought economic collapse, unemployment, despair. Millions looked for a savior, someone to make the chaos make sense. Hitler offered them simplicity. He told them they were victims, and that the solution was not to change themselves, but to remove those who had poisoned them. His voice rose in beer halls, echoing through a nation desperate to believe anything. And so, as the decade turned, an ancient hatred became a modern movement, a movement that promised greatness and delivered genocide. The crowd cheered. The papers applauded. The flags waved. Few saw that beneath the red banners and gold eagles, beneath the slogans of unity and purity, there was an old whisper growing into a scream. The same whisper that had haunted Europe's conscience for 1,000 years. The stage was ready. The language of extermination had already been written in sermons, pamphlets, and lies. All it needed now was power, and one man ruthless enough to use it. Hitler was waiting. The world was watching. And soon, silence would no longer protect anyone. Chapter 2. Hitler's Vision of Racial Purity. Berlin, 1933. Torches flare against the night sky, smoke rising above the Brandenburg Gate. The chants echoed down the streets like thunder, thousands of voices merging into one rhythm, one obsession. Ein Volk, ein Reich, ein Führer. One people, one empire, one leader. The flames light up the flags, red and black and white, the swastika spinning like a hypnotic wheel in the firelight. Amid the roar stands a man whose words have already become law. His eyes do not blink. His hand, raised in a salute, trembles not from passion but precision. Adolf Hitler, the self-proclaimed savior of Germany, had not just captured a nation. He was beginning to reshape its soul. But this was not sudden madness. It was the unfolding of a vision he had carried for years, scribbled in the pages of Mein Kampf, born in the trenches of the Great War, and nurtured in his bitterness after defeat. In his mind, Germany had fallen not because of military weakness, but because of internal decay, a contamination that had to be purified. He saw race not as a social idea, but as destiny, and destiny, to him, demanded cleansing. The so-called Aryan race, with its mythic blonde hair and blue eyes, was to be the master species, guardians of civilization. Every other race, he believed, was a threat, a toxin that diluted greatness. It was not politics. It was biology. As the crowd roared his name, the machinery of that biology began to move. Behind the spectacle, in cold offices and committee rooms, scientists, doctors, and bureaucrats began translating fantasy into policy. The ideology of racial purity demanded definitions: who belonged and who did not. Anthropologists measured skulls, doctors traced family bloodlines, and lawyers sharpened the language of exclusion. What had once been rumor and hatred was now written in legal German, stamped with state seals, and backed by the full force of law. The idea was simple, terrifyingly so. Germany would be reborn through purification. Hitler believed that the same way one pruned a diseased tree, one must remove the rotten branches from the Volk, the national body. Jews, Roma, the disabled, the mentally ill, homosexuals, and political dissidents were no longer citizens. They were contaminants. The future Reich would be pure, strong, and unified, not through compassion, but through elimination. In April 1933, the first wave of Nazi legislation struck like a hammer. The law for the restoration of the professional civil service ordered all Jews and political opponents dismissed from government jobs. Teachers, judges, and doctors found themselves stripped of their positions overnight. Their crime was not incompetence. It was ancestry. Universities followed next, purging Jewish professors and banning Jewish students. Even the German Academy of Sciences expelled its brightest minds. Einstein fled. Others stayed, hoping reason might outlast madness. It wouldn't. Propaganda made sure of that. Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's minister of propaganda, understood the mind like a weapon. He transformed prejudice into art. Posters, films, textbooks, all soaked in one message: purity is strength, and contamination is death. In movie theaters, German families watched films portraying Jews as rats, communists as traitors, and Aryans as heroes. Radio speeches drummed the same rhythm into living rooms. Children learned it before they could even read. Blood is everything, their teachers said. Blood does not lie. The transformation was both chilling and efficient. People didn't wake up one day and see themselves as executioners. They were trained into it, inch by inch, slogan by slogan. The Nazi Party understood something terrible about human nature, that the line between morality and obedience can disappear if you redraw it slowly enough. And in Germany, the line was vanishing. To Hitler, the Jewish people were not just scapegoats. They were the central antagonist in his myth of the world. He called them the anti-race, the opposite of everything pure. In Mein Kampf, he wrote that history was not a struggle between nations, but between races. And in that struggle, only one could survive. He saw compassion as weakness, mercy as decay. In his speeches, he spoke not as a man, but as a prophet of biology, claiming he was obeying the laws of nature. The wolf does not pity the lamb, he said, and neither should man. The Nuremberg rallies turned ideology into theater. Hundreds of thousands gathered, disciplined and glowing under floodlights, while Hitler's voice rolled across the field like thunder. The music swelled, the torches waved, and the banners rippled in perfect symmetry. It was hypnotic, designed to erase individuality. When people shouted, "Heil Hitler," they weren't just saluting a man. They were surrendering themselves to a vision that promised greatness and demanded purity. In 1935, that vision became law. The Nuremberg laws codified race. They declared that only those of German or kindred blood could be citizens of the Reich. Jews were reduced to subjects, stripped of voting rights, forbidden to marry or even sleep with Germans. Their relationships labeled racial defilement. The laws didn't use bullets. They used paperwork, and the results were just as deadly. A man could be arrested not for what he did, but for who his grandparents were. Bloodlines became death sentences. The Nazis used pseudoscience to justify their cruelty. Doctors stood beside charts displaying skull shapes and hair colors, declaring who was Aryan and who was not. In classrooms, children learned to trace their ancestry and report any impurity. Even love became a crime. Young couples were forced to prove racial purity before marriage. Hospitals sterilized those deemed unfit to reproduce, the mentally ill, the disabled, even people accused of promiscuity. It was called racial hygiene. The irony was invisible to those enforcing it. They believed they were healers of the nation. By 1938, the vision of purity had become an obsession. Jews were banned from owning businesses, attending concerts, or entering public parks. Their passports were stamped with a red J, branding them as outsiders even beyond Germany's borders. Doctors and lawyers could no longer practice. Children were expelled from schools. It was not yet genocide, but it was exile by humiliation. Then came November 9th, Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. Across Germany and Austria, Nazi stormtroopers and civilians smashed Jewish shops, burned synagogues, and dragged thousands to concentration camps. The streets glittered with shards of glass, reflecting the fires of hatred that now burned in full view. Firefighters were ordered not to save Jewish homes. The police arrested the victims instead of the attackers. It was no longer a question of what the Nazis could do. It was a warning of what they would do next. The world watched, horrified, but few acted. Foreign newspapers condemned the violence, but governments turned away refugees. Borders closed. Ships carrying desperate families were denied entry. Hitler saw this not as failure, but as proof of his theory that the world didn't care about the Jews, that he could do anything and no one would stop him. And he was right. Behind the spectacle of brutality lay a quieter, more calculated cruelty. The propaganda of purity had infiltrated every institution. German doctors wrote textbooks on racial biology. Universities hosted lectures on Jewish degeneracy. Police officers attended seminars on racial awareness. Each piece of the machine clicked into place. And while soldiers drilled with rifles, clerks prepared the paperwork that would one day decide who lived and who died. Hitler's vision went beyond Germany. He saw the entire world through racial hierarchy. Slavs, he believed, were subhuman, destined to serve. Africans and Asians, in his view, existed only to be ruled. Even within Europe, he ranked nations by worth. The British as potential allies, the French as corrupted by racial mixing, and the Jews as the eternal corruptors of all. In his mind, global domination was not just political, it was biological evolution. The strong must destroy the weak, or the world would rot. He found justification in every corner of history. The ancient Spartans, who cast weak infants from cliffs, became his heroes. He admired America's segregation laws and its sterilization programs. He studied eugenic policies in Sweden and the United States, convinced that the world was already leaning his way. All he needed was power to accelerate what he saw as natural selection. But power corrupts differently when it believes it's righteous. By 1939, the ideology of purity had become more than belief. It was a weapon. Germany prepared for expansion, not merely for territory, but for cleansing. Hitler called it Lebensraum, living space. The German people, he claimed, needed room to grow, and that room would come from the east. Millions of Slavs would be displaced or killed to make way for Aryan settlers. It was a war not just for land, but for blood. The Nazi state was now a laboratory for social engineering. The Hitler Youth raised children to see loyalty as holiness. Boys learned to fight and to kill without question. Girls were taught their duty was to bear racially pure children for the Reich. Propaganda films showed blonde families smiling under swastika banners, their homes glowing in pastoral light, while unseen millions were erased from the frame. It was a vision of paradise built on invisible graves. And yet, inside Germany, many didn't see horror. They saw hope. The unemployed found work. The humiliated found pride. The broken nation found order. The cruelty was easy to ignore when it promised prosperity. That is how the machinery of purity worked. Not through fear alone, but through seduction. People weren't just following orders. They were believing. The churches largely remained silent. Some clergy joined the Nazi cause, believing they could purify Christianity by removing its Jewish roots. Others turn away, unwilling to risk persecution. A few resisted, like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, but their voices were small against the roar of the Reich. Silence became complicity, and complicity became policy. By the eve of the Second World War, the idea of the racially pure Germany was complete. The camps were ready. The laws were in place. The people were conditioned. Hitler stood before the Reichstag and declared that if war came, it would mean the annihilation of the Jewish race in Europe. Few took the words literally. They thought it was bluster, a threat. But for Hitler, it was a promise. And as the storm gathered over Europe, the vision that had begun in torchlight rallies and classroom diagrams was about to step into reality. Tanks rolled toward Poland, carrying soldiers who believed they were the spearhead of destiny. Behind them marched bureaucrats with lists, scientists with charts, and engineers with blueprints. A nation had convinced itself that murder was purification and conquest was salvation. The dream of racial purity was no longer confined to speeches or books. It had uniforms, bullets, and trains. It had a plan. And soon, the world would see what happens when an idea born in myth and hatred is given steel and power. The seeds had been planted, the laws written, the crowds prepared. The fire that had once burned in torchlight was about to consume nations. And from that fire, something far darker would rise, the final solution itself. Chapter 3. The Machinery of Hate. The sun had not yet risen over Dachau on that cold morning in 1933, but the air already carried the metallic bite of fear. Boots struck gravel in rhythm, dogs barked in the distance, and barbed wire stretched like veins around the perimeter of a world being born. The sign at the entrance read, Arbeit macht frei, work sets you free, but there was no freedom here, only the beginning of a machine that would come to define evil itself. Dachau was the prototype, the experiment, the first working model of Hitler's new idea. That terror could be systematized, and death could be organized like industry. When the first prisoners arrived, communists, trade unionists, and political opponents, they didn't yet understand what this place was. They thought it might be a labor camp, a temporary punishment. But the guards knew. The SS, led by Heinrich Himmler, was not just building a prison. They were building the foundation of a new world order, one in which fear will be the most efficient tool of obedience. Every blow, every command, every scream in Dachau was a test run for what would later become a continent-wide system of annihilation. Himmler called it discipline. In truth, it was dehumanization disguised as order. Prisoners were stripped, shaved, beaten, and forced to stand for hours in formation until their identities dissolved into numbers. A man was no longer a man. He was a unit of labor, a resource, a statistic. Guards were taught that mercy was treason and that cruelty was a form of loyalty. They recorded everything: arrival times, punishment logs, labor output, because efficiency was purity, and purity was the highest virtue of the Reich. From the beginning, the SS and Gestapo worked hand in hand. The Gestapo, the secret state police, became the invisible skeleton of Nazi control, their reach extending into every street, every neighborhood, every whisper. They didn't need to arrest everyone. They only needed to make people believe they could. Fear to the rest. A single denunciation, a rumor, or a word spoken too loudly could mean disappearance. One day, your neighbor was there. The next, his door stood open, his bed still warm, his name erased. Meanwhile, the SS grew from a small paramilitary unit into a state within a state. Under Himmler's direction, it became the ideological elite, a brotherhood of men who swore not to Germany, but to Hitler personally. They saw themselves as the knights of the new order, guardians of racial purity, scientists of terror. Their black uniforms were designed to intimidate, tailored with precision, polished with pride. They looked like the embodiment of control, but inside the perfection lay rot. The Nazis understood that violence alone could not sustain power forever. It had to be rationalized, turned into something bureaucratic, something that could be justified with paperwork and planning. That's what made the machinery of hate so unstoppable. It was built not by madmen foaming at the mouth, but by clerks, engineers, lawyers, and doctors who believed they were doing their jobs. Every department of the German government had a part to play. The Ministry of Justice wrote laws that criminalized entire populations. The Ministry of the Interior tracked ancestry and citizenship. The railways prepared transport schedules for prisoners. Even banks calculated the value of confiscated property. The extermination of a people was being planned in the language of efficiency. It was in this atmosphere that concentration camps multiplied. Sachsenhausen near Berlin, Buchenwald near Weimar, Ravensbrück for women, all modeled after Dachau's blueprint. Each had its commandant, its guards, its electric fences, and its crematoria. They were not yet centers of mass killing. That horror was still to come. But they were laboratories of control, places where ideology was practiced until it became instinct. The guards learned how far they could go, how long a man could suffer before breaking, how to make human beings disappear not only physically but spiritually. The camps were also propaganda. Germans were told these facilities were re-education centers for criminals and political traitors, places of discipline for those who had lost their way. Newspapers published photographs of clean barracks and smiling workers. But behind the gates, starvation, disease, and torture ruled. Men were forced to dig their own graves as training exercises. Prisoners were hanged for stealing a crust of bread. Every cruelty served a purpose, to prove that compassion had no place in the new Germany. Back in Berlin, Himmler was expanding his empire. He established the Totenkopfverband, the Death's Head units, whose skull insignia marked them as the guardians of the camps. Their training was a psychological conditioning disguised as patriotism. They were taught to see prisoners not as people, but as subhuman elements infecting the body of the Reich. One SS instructor told recruits, "You must learn to look into the eyes of 1,000 men about to die, and still sleep at night." They did. At the same time, Joseph Goebbels continued to flood Germany with propaganda. His ministry produced posters showing Jews as disease-carrying parasites, caricatured with exaggerated features. Films like The Eternal Jew portrayed them as rats scurrying beneath the streets of civilization. This was not mere slander. It was preparation. The human mind can justify anything once it no longer sees its victims as human. And that was the point. The SS would kill, but propaganda would make the killing acceptable. As Hitler consolidated power, his reach spread beyond Germany's borders. The annexation of Austria in 1938 brought new victims into the machine. Viennese Jews were forced to scrub sidewalks with toothbrushes while onlookers laughed. Synagogues burned. Businesses were looted. The local police watched. The machinery didn't need orders. It worked automatically now, fueled by ideology and indifference. Across Europe, Nazi agents set up offices, databases, and lists. Bureaucrats filled out forms identifying Jews, Roma, and political enemies. The Holocaust would later depend on these records. The genocide was already being written in ink. The Gestapo perfected methods of interrogation and surveillance. In their offices, the air reeked of sweat, blood, and ink. They used fear as both tool and trophy. Prisoners were beaten, forced to sign confessions, and sent to camps with a single word: protective custody. It sounded harmless, almost legal. That was the genius of the system. It cloaked horror in the language of administration. People could be erased without a trial, without evidence, without a trace. Meanwhile, ordinary Germans became participants. Not all wore uniforms. Some denounced their co-workers for unpatriotic behavior. Others took over abandoned Jewish apartments. Some simply stayed silent. The machinery didn't need everyone to be evil. It only needed enough people to obey and enough to look away. Evil thrives best when it feels ordinary. In 1939, as Hitler prepared for war, Himmler and Reinhard Heydrich began to expand the camp network into occupied territories. When Poland fell, the Nazis transformed its cities into laboratories of oppression. Warsaw and Lodz were sealed into ghettos, vast prisons surrounded by walls and armed guards. Inside, hunger became a weapon. Food rations were so small that people resorted to eating wallpaper paste, stray cats, and anything that might fill the void. The ghettos were not yet extermination zones, but they were death sentences delayed. Disease spread faster than bullets. The machinery was evolving. While the world focused on the battlefields, another war was already being waged in the shadows. A war against civilians, fought with lists, walls, and starvation. The camps became essential to this new war. Prisoners from conquered nations were shipped in by the thousands. Polish intellectuals, priests, and teachers were executed or enslaved. Political opponents vanished. The SS recorded everything: train numbers, arrival times, quotas of forced labor. Every step of the Holocaust would later mirror this precision. In Berlin, architects began designing larger, more efficient camps. They drew blueprints for barracks, watchtowers, and crematoriums, as if designing factories. The industrial mindset of the Reich had found its most perverse application: the production of death. Engineers calculated how many bodies a furnace could burn per day. Chemists experimented with gas compounds for mass killing. They told themselves it was science, progress, necessity. They were building the future, they said, and they were. Just not one humanity could survive. Himmler, ever the administrator, was proud of this efficiency. He spoke of the camps as necessary institutions for maintaining racial hygiene. In his reports, he described the deportation of Jews as cleansing operations, using the language of medicine to disguise mass cruelty. Even the term final solution would emerge from this vocabulary, a phrase cold enough to sound bureaucratic, final enough to silence debate. The Gestapo's reach extended into every corner of occupied Europe. In France, they hunted members of the resistance and rounded up Jews for deportation. In the Netherlands, they worked with local collaborators to identify Jewish families. In Norway, in Greece, in Hungary, the pattern repeated. A knock at the door, a list read aloud. A family vanished before sunrise. The machinery did not sleep. Inside the camps, life became a study in despair. Prisoners were forced into endless labor, building roads, munitions, and even more camps. Those who collapsed were beaten or shot. Guards practiced executions for sport. Doctors performed medical experiments on prisoners, injecting diseases or freezing bodies to test survival times. The victims were stripped not only of life but of dignity, reduced to data in notebooks. For the advancement of science, the reports read, there was no end to what could be justified in the name of progress. And yet, in the midst of this horror, there were moments of resistance, small, fragile acts of defiance that the machinery could never fully crush. Prisoners risked death to smuggle messages, share scraps of food, or record what they witnessed. Some German citizens, too, defied the system quietly, hiding Jews or spreading forbidden information. But they were rare, and the machine devoured them quickly. For every act of courage, 100 acts of betrayal followed. By 1941, as the Nazis prepared to invade the Soviet Union, the machinery of hate reached its next stage. Mobile killing units called Einsatzgruppen were formed, tasked with following the army and exterminating Jews, communists, and anyone deemed undesirable. The camps had taught the methods. The Gestapo had provided the intelligence. Now, mass murder could move with the army. The machinery had learned to walk. Every part of the system, from the SS to the police, from the clerks to the train conductors, functioned like gears in a clockwork of death. There was no single villain turning the crank. The entire nation was complicit in keeping it running. Hitler didn't need to give every order. The ideology gave them permission. And once permission was granted, there was no limit to how far the machinery could go. The Nazi regime had achieved what few tyrannies ever had. It made evil efficient. It stripped away emotion and replaced it with procedure. It convinced ordinary men that cruelty was duty and that obedience was virtue. By the time the first gas chambers were built, the system was already perfect. The camps, the Gestapo, the SS, all the parts of the machine were ready. The final solution would not appear out of chaos. It would rise from order. As 1941 dawned, Europe stood under the shadow of a new empire, one built on hatred, precision, and silence. The machinery of death was humming, waiting for the command that would transform persecution into extermination. The blueprints were drawn. The camps were full. The trains were ready. All that remained was for the machine to shift into its final gear. And when it did, the world would tremble at what human hands could build when guided by hate instead of heart. Chapter 4. Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. It began with the sound of shattering glass. Not the polite tinkling of a dropped cup, but the violent crack of shop windows exploding under the weight of hatred. Streets that just hours earlier had echoed with footsteps and laughter now rang with chaos. Flames rose into the night sky, turning the clouds red above German cities. It was November 9th, 1938. The world would remember it as Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. But for those who lived through it, it was not the glass that broke. It was the illusion that anything human was left in the Third Reich. In the afternoon hours before the pogrom began, a teenage boy named Herschel Grinspan sat in a small Paris apartment, trembling as he read a letter from his family. They had been expelled from Germany, thrown into a freezing no-man's land on the Polish border, stripped of everything they owned. His father's words were desperate, his mother's written in shaking ink. Herschel felt something snap inside him. In rage and despair, he walked into the German embassy and shot a Nazi diplomat named Ernst von Rath. Von Rath would die 2 days later, and Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's minister of propaganda, seized upon the tragedy like a gift. He turned one young man's pain into an excuse for vengeance. That night, Hitler was attending a celebration in Munich, the anniversary of his failed beer hall putsch. As the crowd roared and the beer flowed, Goebbels whispered in the Führer's ear. He told him that the German people were furious, that spontaneous demonstrations were already breaking out against the Jews. Hitler nodded. No official orders were given, just a smile, a nod, a signal, a green light disguised as silence. Within hours, the machinery of hate roared to life. Across Germany and Austria, Nazi stormtroopers and civilians poured into the streets, their torches slicing through the darkness. They smashed the windows of Jewish-owned shops, looted their goods, and set synagogues ablaze. In some towns, the firelight glowed so bright that it turned night into day. The smell of burning books, cloth, and flesh mixed in the air, a stench of civilization collapsing into barbarism. Police officers stood aside, instructed not to interfere. Firefighters were ordered to protect only Aryan property. For the Jews, there was no help coming. In Berlin, entire blocks went up in flames. Synagogues that had stood for centuries were reduced to ashes. Torah scrolls, centuries old and handwritten by generations of faith, burned like dry leaves. The sound of shattering glass echoed like gunfire. Families hid in basements, clutching one another as mobs tore through their neighborhoods. Children screamed as men in uniform kicked down doors, dragged fathers into the streets, and beat them under the street lamps. Women begged, only to be laughed at or spat on. One witness later said that the night sounded like Germany laughing at itself in the mirror. By dawn, more than 200 synagogues had been burned to the ground. Over 7,000 Jewish businesses were destroyed. Windows littered the streets like frozen rain, giving the pogrom its haunting name. The shards sparkled in the morning light, but there was no beauty in them, only the reflection of horror. Around 30,000 Jewish men were arrested and sent to concentration camps like Dachau and Buchenwald. Many would never return. The others came home as walking ghosts, broken, silent, unrecognizable to their families. For the Nazi leadership, it was a test, and it worked. The police followed orders. The public, by and large, did nothing. The violence was so widespread, so coordinated, that it could only have happened with state approval. And yet, officially, the regime called it a spontaneous uprising of the German people. Newspapers repeated the lie. Foreign journalists reported the truth, but outside Germany, The world's outrage came as little more than words on paper. No army marched. No sanctions followed. Hitler watched, smiled, and learned the most important lesson of all. The world would not stop him. For ordinary Jews, Kristallnacht was the moment denial died. For years, many had believed that the persecution would pass, that the madness would burn itself out. They were Germans, after all, veterans, doctors, professors, neighbors. But now their streets had turned against them. The glass that covered the sidewalks was not just from broken windows. It was from broken trust. After that night, no Jew in Germany could believe they still had a future there. Insurance companies refused to pay for the damages caused by the pogrom. Instead, the Nazi government fined the Jewish community 1 billion Reichsmarks for provoking the violence. Jewish property was confiscated, businesses were transferred to Aryan ownership, and all remaining Jewish children were expelled from public schools. Overnight, an entire population had been turned into beggars in their own homeland. What had begun as discrimination was now destruction. Inside Germany, propaganda turned the massacre into justification. Radio broadcasts and newspapers blamed international Jewry for the chaos. Goebbels wrote that the German people had cleansed their streets of vermin. In the days that followed, Jews were banned from theaters, public parks, and even from owning pets or cars. It was a descent into total exclusion, one decree after another, stripping away every shred of normal life. The regime had discovered something chilling. Once people are dehumanized, their suffering becomes invisible. In Vienna, once a city of culture and music, the streets became a theater of humiliation. Jewish men were forced to kneel and scrub the sidewalks clean while crowds jeered. Rabbis were made to dance in the streets before being beaten. The cruelty was not only physical, it was psychological, designed to break the spirit as well as the body. And as the Jews scrubbed and bled, their neighbors took photographs, smiling. The same people who had once shopped in their stores now watched their ruin like a holiday parade. Internationally, Kristallnacht sent shockwaves, but sympathy was limited by indifference and fear. The United States condemned the violence, but refused to open its borders to Jewish refugees. Britain issued cautious statements while maintaining strict immigration quotas. The League of Nations, powerless and divided, offered no solution. It was not that the world did not know. It was that it did not want to know. To intervene would mean confronting a horror that polite diplomacy could not contain. Inside the Nazi hierarchy, the success of Kristallnacht solidified the power of the SS over the SA and the police. Himmler and Heydrich took control of the aftermath, using the chaos to expand their authority. They ordered that Jews must pay for their own imprisonment and the repair of the damage. The Nazis had turned hate into profit. Bank accounts were frozen, properties seized, and every Jewish home became state loot. Germany's economy grew richer on the ashes of its victims. For Hitler, this was not just vengeance, it was strategy. The pogrom served as both a warning and a rehearsal. He watched how the nation reacted, how the world stayed silent, and he understood what was possible. Kristallnacht was not the beginning of violence. It was the transition from persecution to annihilation. It showed that an entire society could commit atrocity without conscience if told it was justice. In the weeks after the pogrom, trains began to move quietly through Germany's railways, carrying thousands of Jewish men to concentration camps. Many were told they were being taken for questioning. Most were never seen again. In the camps, the conditions were brutal. Prisoners were forced to stand barefoot in snow for hours, beaten with rifle butts, starve until their faces hollowed. Guards laughed as they tested their limits, turning cruelty into entertainment. Some men died from exhaustion, others from despair. The survivors were released months later, only to sign over their property and agree to leave Germany forever. The irony was cruel. Many tried to flee, but few nations would accept them. Ships carrying Jewish refugees wandered the seas, turned away from every port. The world watched and waited, unsure, unwilling, unready. Hitler noticed. They may cry over the Jews, he told his inner circle, but no one wants them. That single observation would shape the logic of the final solution. If no one would take the Jews, then Germany would make sure there were none left to take. The aftermath of Kristallnacht rippled through German society. Some citizens were disturbed, shocked by the destruction, but their protests were whispers easily drowned by the thunder of propaganda. Most people simply adjusted, as people always do. The sight of broken glass became normal. The absence of Jewish shopkeepers was explained away. The silence where voices once were felt like peace. This was the genius of terror. It did not always require agreement, only adaptation. In schools, teachers explained the pogroms as necessary acts of defense. Children drew pictures of burning synagogues in their classrooms. Newspapers ran stories celebrating Aryan triumph. And in homes across Germany, people told themselves that it was unfortunate, perhaps excessive, but ultimately justified. They comforted themselves with the illusion that order had been restored, even as civilization itself had been shattered. For the Jewish community, the emotional toll was immeasurable. Families gathered what little they had left, desperate to escape. Some sold heirlooms, others bribed officials, others simply ran. Those who remained lived in constant fear. Every knock on the door felt like a death sentence. The same streets that once carried children to school now carried soldiers and smoke. In many towns, the ashes of burned synagogues still smoldered for days. The smell lingered long after the fires died, a ghost that refused to leave. In the camps, a new phase of Nazi brutality was taking shape. Prisoners from Kristallnacht were used for forced labor, building roads, cleaning latrines, constructing barracks for new arrivals. SS officers experimented with new methods of punishment, testing how far men could be pushed before death. It was a grim rehearsal for genocide, a laboratory of cruelty where ideology met engineering. Every act was recorded, refined, perfected. When the time came for mass extermination, the system would already know how to function. Kristallnacht was the night the Nazi regime crossed a line from oppression to open violence. It was not chaos, it was calculation. Every flame was ordered, every arrest documented, every humiliation recorded. The pogrom was orchestrated from above, but carried out by ordinary citizens below. It revealed the terrifying truth that the line between neighbor and executioner can vanish overnight. And yet, even in that darkness, there were flickers of humanity. Some Germans, risking their lives, hid Jewish friends or helped them escape. Others stood silently outside burning synagogues, tears in their eyes, powerless to stop what they knew was wrong. But their courage was isolated, their resistance invisible. In a nation of millions, kindness had become a dangerous act. As winter settled over Germany, the streets grew quiet again. The glass was swept away, the fires extinguished, and life appeared to return to normal. But beneath that illusion, something irreversible had happened. A moral barrier had been shattered, one that could never be rebuilt. The Nazi regime had discovered that it could commit open violence without consequence. And once a regime learns that, there is no turning back. The night of broken glass was not just a riot. It was a warning. It was the sound of civilization cracking under its own weight, the echo of boots on cobblestones, the laughter of men who believed they were righteous as they burned their neighbors' homes. It was the first step on the road to Auschwitz. When dawn came after Kristallnacht, the streets of Germany glistened with frost and broken glass. The smell of smoke still hung in the air. Shopkeepers swept their ruined storefronts in silence. Children kicked shards of glass down the gutters, too young to understand what they were walking through. Above them, the swastika flags flapped in the wind, symbols of a nation that had traded its soul for a lie. The world turned its face away, pretending not to see. And in that silence, in that terrible calm after the storm, the final solution began to take shape. Chapter 5. The Ghettos. Life behind walls. It began quietly, with hammers and nails. The sound of wood striking would echo through the narrow streets of Warsaw as men were ordered to build walls around their own neighborhoods. They were told it was for their protection, to separate them from disease, to maintain order. But the truth hung heavy in the cold air. These weren't walls of safety. They were walls of disappearance. By the end of 1940, nearly 500,000 Jews would be sealed behind those walls, their world reduced to a few square miles of hunger, fear, and fading hope. The Germans called it the Warsaw Ghetto. For those trapped inside, it was a slow-motion death sentence. When the Nazis invaded Poland in September 1939, their tanks crushed cities in weeks. But even faster than the army came the ideology. Orders flowed from Berlin to segregate, isolate, and exploit. Jews were stripped of property, forced to wear armbands marked with the Star of David, and relocated into confined districts. The ghettos were not random. They were planned, methodical, each one a testing ground for control. Warsaw, Lodz, Krakow, Lublin, each became a cage. Within them, human lives were compressed into statistics. Every street corner turned into a checkpoint. Every home became a cell. The walls rose quickly, built by Jewish labor under German supervision. Brick by brick, the city closed in on itself. The final wall in Warsaw stood over 10 feet high, crowned with barbed wire, guarded by men with rifles. From the outside, life went on as usual. Shops opened, trams passed, people pretended not to see. Inside, time began to rot. Days blurred into hunger. Families of 10 crowded into single rooms, sharing one sink, one blanket, one breath. Water was scarce, electricity unreliable. The stench of sewage and decay hung in the air. Rats scurried freely, and the weak moved slower than the vermin that fed on them. Food was the weapon that ruled everything. The official German ration for Jews in Warsaw was less than 200 calories a day, a slow starvation disguised as policy. Bread became currency, soup became salvation. Children crept through holes in the wall at night, smuggling potatoes and onions in their shirts, risking their lives for scraps. German soldiers shot them on sight. Yet even hunger could not crush the instinct to live. Mothers boiled grass to feed their babies. Men traded wedding rings for crumbs of bread. A child's laughter became a memory that hurt to hear. In the Lodz ghetto, known in German as Litzmannstadt, the situation was even harsher. It was run like a factory, overseen by a Jewish administration under German orders. Mordecai Chaim Rumkowski, the so-called elder of the Jews, believed that labor could buy survival. He begged the Germans to let his people live by working for them. "Give me your hands," he told the ghetto, "and I will save you." Workshops produced uniforms, boots, and toys for the Reich. But the logic was cruel. Every ounce of productivity only delayed the inevitable. The Germans didn't see workers. They saw resources to be used up, then discarded. Rumkowski's rule became infamous. To keep the ghetto functioning, he made impossible choices: who would work, who would eat, who would be deported. Some saw him as a collaborator, others as a desperate man, trying to save what little could be saved. His most haunting moment came in September 1942, when the Germans demanded that all children under 10 and the elderly be resettled. Everyone knew what that meant. Standing before thousands of terrified parents, Rumkowski pleaded, his voice breaking, "Give me your children." The words echoed through the crowd like the sound of something sacred breaking. Mothers screamed, fathers wept, and the ghetto learned the full meaning of despair. Life inside the ghettos was a constant negotiation between survival and morality. Some people became black market traders, smuggling food and medicine. Others joined underground resistance groups, printing secret newspapers, teaching children in hidden schools, documenting everything with smuggled cameras and notebooks. Artists painted on scraps of paper. Poets wrote verses on the back of ration cards. Doctors kept detailed records of starvation and disease, knowing that if they could not save the living, they could at least leave testimony for the future. The Germans monitored everything. Any sign of resistance, any smuggling, any whisper of defiance was punished with death. Public hangings became routine, meant to remind the starving that hope was forbidden. Corpses lay in the streets, frozen in winter, bloated in summer. There were so many that carts came daily to collect them. Children learned to step over bodies without looking. Death had become part of the scenery, as common as cobblestones. And yet, even here, humanity refused to die. In the Warsaw Ghetto, a symphony orchestra performed in secret. Teachers taught arithmetic to barefoot children in basements. Rabbis whispered prayers behind boarded windows. People married, gave birth, celebrated small victories of survival. To live one more day was an act of rebellion. In a world built on the idea that they were not human, to feel love, to sing, to learn, that was defiance. But defiance could not stop disease. Typhus swept through the ghettos, carried by lice and hunger. Doctors fought it with empty hands, writing prescriptions they knew could never be filled. Hospitals ran out of beds, then blankets, then walls. People died sitting up, waiting for medicine that would never come. The living were too weak to bury the dead. By the end of 1941, tens of thousands had already perished without a bullet fired. The Nazis called it natural attrition. The victims called it slow murder. Outside the walls, life continued with eerie normalcy. Non-Jewish Poles walked past the ghetto, hearing the cries inside, but powerless to help. Some tried, tossing bread over the wall, hiding families in attics, forging papers. Others collaborated, profiting from the misery next door. The city existed in two worlds, one starving, one pretending not to see. The wall between them was more than brick. It was moral distance, and it grew higher every day. The German authorities turned the ghettos into economic machines. Forced labor became policy. In Warsaw, workshops produced army uniforms, furniture, and equipment. The Germans pocketed the profits while rationing starvation-level food back to the workers. The system was grotesque efficiency. People fed just enough to keep them alive for exploitation. It was capitalism without conscience, bureaucracy without humanity. Still, resistance grew quietly beneath the surface. Underground groups smuggled weapons, established secret printing presses, and forged documents. Young people, barely in their 20s, formed militias, training in basements, dreaming of revolt. Among them were future heroes of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, Mordecai Anielewicz, Yitzhak Zuckerman, and Zivia Lebetkin, names that history would one day remember, though none of them expected to survive. They knew what was coming. The Germans were not building walls to contain life. They were building corridors for death. By 1941, deportations began. The Germans used the euphemism resettlement to the east. Families were told they would be sent to work camps, to better conditions. They packed their few belongings, hopeful or afraid, and marched to the train stations. There were no work camps waiting. The trains led to places with names that soon became synonymous with death. Chelmno, Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka. At first, people believed the lies. Then letters stopped coming, and the truth spread like infection. There was no resettlement. There was only smoke. Inside the ghettos, rumors of gas vans and mass graves began to circulate. People whispered about entire villages disappearing overnight. No one wanted to believe it. The human mind resists the unthinkable until it becomes undeniable. But by the winter of 1941, denial was no longer possible. The trains kept coming, and none returned. Mothers began hiding their children in cupboards, in attics, in cellars. Some sent them over the wall to Christian families, hoping a stranger might do what they no longer could, save a life. In the Warsaw Ghetto, the walls now felt like the edges of the world. Snow fell through the cracks in the rooftops. The streets were silent except for the rumble of carts collecting the dead. And yet, somewhere beneath the silence, there was the sound of writing, the work of a man named Emanuel Ringelblum. He and a group of teachers, historians, and social workers created the Onyx Shabbat Archive, a secret collection of diaries, documents, photographs, and testimonies. They buried the archive in milk cans and metal boxes, determined that if they could not survive, their story would. Their words were their rebellion. As the months turned to years, the ghettos began to vanish one by one. In smaller towns, Liquidation was swift. German trucks arrived, soldiers shouted orders, and entire populations were herded onto trains. Streets were left empty, windows broken, silence total. In Warsaw and Lodz, the process was slower, more deliberate. The Germans needed the labor, but once the new extermination camps were ready, even that usefulness ended. Between 1942 and 43, nearly all remaining ghettos were liquidated. The word itself was cold, mechanical, efficient, exactly how the Nazis wanted it. By the time the liquidation of the Warsaw Ghetto began in the summer of 1942, over 300,000 people had already been deported to Treblinka. The trains left daily, filled with men, women, and children packed so tightly that many suffocated before arrival. The Germans called it Operation Reinhard. They called the trains transports. They called the victims cargo. Language itself had become complicit. Those who remained in the ghetto watched as their neighbors vanished. Buildings stood hollow, windows empty, courtyards quiet. The population shrank from 500,000 to a few tens of thousands. And those who survived understood what it meant. They were next. They had seen too much to believe the lies. And so, in the ruins, something began to stir. Resistance was no longer an idea. It was a necessity. Young fighters gathered weapons, plotted escape routes, and prepared to make their stand. The walls that once imprisoned them would soon become their fortress. But before that uprising, there was the waiting, the final, unbearable months of starvation and fear. Every sound outside the window felt like a summons. The Germans played with their prey, spreading false hope one day, terror the next. They posted signs promising better rations, work permits, safety for families. People lined up, desperate to believe. Instead, they were taken to the trains. Lies had become weapons sharper than bullets. And yet, in the midst of this horror, life persisted in fragments. A wedding was held in a candlelit basement. A mother taught her son the alphabet on a piece of cardboard. Musicians played violins in the dark, their strings trembling like the hearts of their listeners. Every act of living was an act of resistance. The Nazis could starve their bodies, but they could not erase their humanity. When the ghettos finally fell, their ruins stood as silent witnesses. Walls stained with soot, windows blackened, streets scattered with belongings that would never be reclaimed. The ghettos had been built to contain life, but in the end, they contained death and memory. The world beyond their walls had continued to turn, unaware that entire universes had vanished inside. The ghettos were not just places. They were symbols of the moment humanity divided itself. They were the proving ground for the final solution, the rehearsal for genocide. The lessons learned there, how to control, how to deceive, how to kill by starvation, would soon be applied on an unimaginable scale. The ghettos were the waiting rooms of death, and the trains that left them were the veins through which the blood of millions would flow into the heart of darkness. When the last walls fell and the last survivors were led away, the silence was deafening. Only the ghosts remained, the laughter of children, the whisper of prayers, the sound of hammers building the walls that would outlive them all. But beneath the rubble of those vanished cities, buried in milk cans and ashes, their voices waited. And when they were finally unearthed after the war, they spoke of hunger and hope, of cruelty and courage, of what it meant to be human in a world that had forgotten humanity. The ghettos were never meant to last. They were the bridge between isolation and extermination, between prejudice and genocide. And when that bridge collapsed, it did not just take with it the lives trapped inside. It dragged all of Europe into the abyss. The walls had fallen, but the world would never again claim it did not know what those walls had meant. Chapter 6. Operation Barbarossa and the War of Annihilation. The morning of June 22, 1941, began with the sound of thunder that wasn't weather. Across an 1,100-mile front stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea, the German army unleashed the largest invasion in human history. Operation Barbarossa, the code name for Hitler's attack on the Soviet Union, was not simply another military campaign. It was a crusade built on ideology, a war designed not to conquer, but to cleanse. 3 million soldiers crossed the border that dawn, and with them marched a vision of apocalypse. To the soldiers of the Wehrmacht, the fields of the East looked endless, fertile, and waiting. To the SS and the planners in Berlin, those same fields were a graveyard waiting to be filled. The first hours of the invasion were brutal and swift. Soviet airfields were bombed before their pilots could reach their planes. Entire divisions were encircled and obliterated within days. German tanks, sleek, efficient, unstoppable, roared through Belarus, Ukraine, and the Baltics, cutting through Soviet lines like a scythe through wheat. But beneath the steel and smoke, a different army followed. The Einsatzgruppen, the special task forces of the SS, whose orders were not to fight soldiers, but to kill civilians. Their targets were listed plainly: Jews, communists, intellectuals, Roma, and anyone who might resist. The front lines were not just advancing eastward, they were dragging genocide with them. In the weeks that followed, towns that had survived centuries vanished overnight. In Lithuania, Latvia, in Ukraine, entire Jewish communities were rounded up, marched into forests, and shot into pits. The killings were systematic, mechanical, intimate. Soldiers fired rifles until their arms shook. Villagers were forced to dig their own graves. Mothers were told to hold their children tightly so that a single bullet could pass through both. It was not war. It was slaughter disguised as duty. The victims fell in silence, and the earth swallowed their screams. In one ravine near Kiev, the world's horror found a name: Babi Yar. Babi Yar was a deep gash in the landscape, a natural amphitheater that would soon fill with human bodies. On September 29th and 30th, 1941, 33,771 Jews were murdered there over 2 days. German officers recorded the numbers proudly in their reports, as if counting cattle. Machine guns rattled without pause, the air thick with gunpowder and blood. Children clung to their mothers until the end. By the time the shooting stopped, the ravine was a mountain of corpses. Soldiers stood over it smoking cigarettes, laughing, relieved that it was over. Then they buried the dead beneath sand, as if to hide the evidence of what civilization had become. To Hitler, the invasion of the Soviet Union was not about territory. It was about destiny. He saw the East as Germany's future, a land to be cleansed of inferior races and repopulate with Aryans. His generals called it a military campaign, but his speeches revealed the truth. It was a war of annihilation. The Jews of Eastern Europe were its first victims, but not its only ones. Millions of Soviet prisoners of war were left to starve in open fields, denied food, water, and shelter. Entire villages were burned for sheltering partisans. Civilians were executed for existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. The German army, once seen by its soldiers as honorable, became complicit in crimes so vast that even the word war lost its meaning. In Berlin, the machinery of hate adjusted to this new scale. The Einsatzgruppen sent daily reports to the SS headquarters, listing body counts with bureaucratic precision. The language was cold: executed, liquidated, eliminated. The reports read like business summaries, numbers on a balance sheet of death. Reinhard Heydrich, head of the Reich Main Security Office, oversaw the operations from afar, ensuring that each unit met its quotas. The Nazi bureaucracy had found its rhythm. Killing was now administrative. But even for the perpetrators, the method of shooting was proving inefficient. Ammunition was costly. Morale among the executioners began to falter. Some drank heavily. Others requested transfers. One officer complained that it was unpleasant to look into the eyes of the victims. The solution, as always in the Third Reich, was to find a technical fix. Gas vans were introduced, mobile chambers disguised as delivery trucks. Victims were loaded inside, the doors sealed, and exhaust fumes redirected into the compartment. When the doors opened again, the passengers were dead. The first experiments were conducted in Chelmno and the occupied Soviet territories. The reports came back positive. Killing could now be industrialized. Meanwhile, on the battlefield, The war that Hitler believed would last weeks dragged into months. The Soviet Union refused to die. Despite devastating losses, new armies seemed to appear from nowhere. The Germans advanced deeper into Russia, but the land itself fought back. Roads turned to mud, engines froze in the bitter cold, and the soldiers began to realize that victory here would demand something far more than strength. It would demand their souls. Villages were torched, and their inhabitants massacred in retaliation for partisan attacks. For every German soldier killed by resistance, 100 civilians were executed. The policy came from the top. Hitler had declared that this was not a normal war. It was a struggle for survival between races. This doctrine turned soldiers into executioners. Ordinary men, clerks, farmers, teachers, found themselves participating in atrocities they would never have imagined back home. Some justified it as obedience. Others convinced themselves that their victims were not human. The line between combat and murder dissolved completely. Historian Christopher Browning would later call it ordinary men doing extraordinary evil. But in those years, no one used such words. They simply followed orders. In the occupied cities, the ghettos swelled with refugees fleeing the front. In Vilna, Riga, and Minsk, tens of thousands were rounded up and shot. In the Baltic states, local collaborators joined eagerly, motivated by fear, greed, or hatred. Antisemitism, long dormant, now found official sanction. The Nazis didn't need to build the machinery alone. They simply gave permission for hate to act. In many cases, neighbors killed neighbors, priests blessed the bullets, and silence became the language of survival. Back in Berlin, the invasion transformed the Nazi leadership. Victory in the East was supposed to prove the superiority of the Aryan race, but instead it revealed its capacity for destruction. As reports of massacres poured in, Hitler grew more obsessed with the idea of extermination. The army was no longer enough. He wanted a final, total solution to the Jewish question. The groundwork for genocide had already been laid in Poland's ghettos, but now, with millions of Jews under German control, the scale had to grow. Operation Barbarossa did not just expand the war. It expanded the idea of what was possible. By the end of 1941, over 1 million Jews had been murdered by bullets. The numbers defied comprehension. Each forest, each ravine, each ditch was a grave. But for the Nazi leadership, it was still not enough. The shootings were too slow, too visible, too personal. The SS needed a system that could kill faster, quieter, and without breaking the executioners. The war in the East had taught them the logistics of mass death. The next step would be to mechanize it. Even as the killing continued, the Wehrmacht pressed deeper into the Soviet Union. By December, German forces stood at the gates of Moscow. Soldiers could see the city's spires through the snow. But then, the weather turned. Temperatures dropped to 40 below zero. Engines froze, rifles jammed, men collapsed in the snow beside their horses. The Red Army counterattacked, and the myth of the invincible Wehrmacht began to crumble. For the first time, Hitler faced the possibility of failure. His rage turned inward, toward the Jews, toward the generals, toward anyone he could blame. Defeat on the battlefield became fuel for more radical measures. In the same winter that soldiers froze outside Moscow, trains began moving quietly toward newly constructed camps in Poland. The names were still unfamiliar: Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka. But soon they would define the meaning of hell. The war in the East had shown Hitler that he could kill millions and the world would not intervene. Now, the machinery of death would leave the forests and step onto the railways. For the civilians trapped in the occupied territories, life became an unending nightmare. Entire villages were erased as part of anti-partisan operations. Men were shot, women and children burned in barns. The ground itself seemed to reject humanity. In Belarus alone, more than 600 villages were wiped from the map. The SS called these cleansing actions. To them, murder had become routine maintenance. In Kiev, locals were forced to help cover the mass graves at Babi Yar. shoveling sand over the bodies of their neighbors. In Smolensk, German officers photographed executions for souvenirs. In Minsk, the ghetto was systematically liquidated, its residents driven into the woods and shot. Each place followed the same script: deportation, execution, erasure. By 1942, there were almost no Jews left in the territories conquered by Operation Barbarossa. The earth was full of them, but the streets were empty. Still, even in the midst of annihilation, acts of resistance emerged. In the forests of Belarus and Ukraine, Jewish partisans formed small groups, attacking German supply lines, rescuing fugitives, and sabotaging railways. They lived on roots and rainwater, hunted like animals, but refused to die quietly. Some were survivors of massacres, crawling from mass graves to fight again. For every partisan killed, 10 more were hunted down. Yet the Germans never understood that even a single act of defiance was victory enough for those who had nothing left to lose. The brutality of the Eastern Front reshaped the very idea of warfare. It was no longer soldier against soldier. It was civilization against humanity itself. When Heinrich Himmler visited Minsk in 1941 and watched an execution, he turned pale, nearly fainting. But later, he composed himself and praised his men for doing a difficult but necessary duty. He ordered them to continue, promising that history would thank them. That was the lie they told themselves, that cruelty was duty, that murder was service, that obedience was heroism. It was the same lie that had echoed since Dachau, now amplified across an entire continent. By the time the Red Army began to push the Germans back in 1943, the landscape of the East had been transformed into a cemetery without borders. The forests hid mass graves. The rivers carried ashes. The villages that once stood alive with song and laughter were now black scars on the earth. The survivors walked among the ruins, half-starved, half-mad, whispering the names of the lost. Operation Barbarossa had failed militarily, but ideologically it had succeeded beyond Hitler's imagination. It had taught his regime how to kill without hesitation, how to destroy entire populations as a matter of policy. And from the ashes of that failure, something even darker was born. The lessons learned in the East became the blueprint for the final solution. The Einsatzgruppen's reports became manuals for efficiency. The logistical experience gained from deporting millions became the foundation of the death camps. The railways that had carried armies now carried victims. The fields that had soaked up blood became the testing ground for genocide. As the German army retreated westward, it left behind not ruins, but instructions. The war of annihilation had proven that mass murder could be systematized, industrialized, and normalized. It had shown that a nation could kill millions without losing its soul, because it had already sold it. Operation Barbarossa was more than a battle. It was the rehearsal for the Holocaust itself. When the snow melted in the spring of 1942, the fields of Eastern Europe revealed their secrets. Bones surfaced from shallow graves. Bits of clothing fluttered in the wind. Locals walked past in silence, afraid to speak of what they saw. The earth had become both witness and accomplice. The ravens circled above, black against the pale sky, feasting on the remains of a civilization that had devoured itself. Operation Barbarossa had begun as a vision of conquest and ended as a lesson in how far hate could reach when unopposed. It was the moment the Holocaust stepped out of ideology and into action, when the bullet and the policy became one. And as the front shifted and the Nazi armies pulled back, the machine they had built did not stop. It simply moved with them, toward Poland, toward Auschwitz, toward the final solution. The war of annihilation had opened the gates of hell, and humanity was already walking through. Chapter 7. The Wannsee Conference, Birth of the Final Solution. The morning of January 20th, 1942, was cold and bright in Berlin. The snow lay thick along the banks of Lake Wannsee, the water beneath frozen and still. The villa that overlooked it was elegant, the kind of place meant for summer holidays and polite society. But that day, it hosted something else, a meeting that would shape the darkest chapter in human history. Inside, the fire crackled in the marble hearth. The table gleamed with polished wood, and servants prepared trays of brandy and cigars. The men who entered were not soldiers dripping with blood. They were bureaucrats, ministers, and officers in clean uniforms, their shoes shining. They came not to argue morality, but logistics. They were there to plan how to murder a continent. Reinhard Heydrich, the chair of the meeting, arrived first. He was tall, blond, and immaculate, his SS uniform pressed to perfection. To those who knew him, he was both brilliance and brutality, cold, efficient, utterly without empathy. Hitler had given him a task: to coordinate the final solution to the Jewish question. That phrase, deliberately sterile, meant one thing: extermination. The war in the East had already shown what was possible. The Einsatzgruppen had killed over 1 million Jews by bullets. But it was too slow, too messy, too public. Heydrich's mission was to make murder efficient, to turn genocide into administration. As the guests arrived, they removed their coats and exchanged small talk. The host, Adolf Eichmann, Heydrich's logistical expert, greeted them with smiles. He had arranged everything: the documents, the seating chart, even the refreshments. To him, this was a matter of paperwork and planning, not morality. Around the table sat 15 men representing the Nazi elite, state secretaries, SS officers, and bureaucrats for various ministries. They were the faces of the modern German state: educated, articulate, professional. Between them, they held the power to decide the fate of 11 million people. When the meeting began, Heydrich's voice was calm and measured. He spoke like a manager outlining a corporate strategy. He explained that the Führer himself had authorized the final solution, that all previous plans for Jewish immigration were now obsolete. The Jews of Europe would not be relocated. They would be eliminated. The word was never spoken aloud, but everyone understood. They nodded as if discussing a tax policy. Eichmann handed out copies of a secret document listing the Jewish population of Europe by country. 11 million names reduced to numbers on a page. France, 300,000. Hungary, 700,000. The Netherlands, 160,000. Poland, over 2 million. The Soviet Union, 5 million. Even neutral nations like Switzerland and Ireland were included. The message was clear: nowhere would be safe. This was not a policy for one nation. It was a blueprint for the world. Heydrich outlined the plan in precise steps. Jews capable of labor would be deported to the East, to massive camps where they would work until they collapsed. Those unable to work, the elderly, the sick, the children, would be treated accordingly. It was a phrase that required no explanation. Behind that polite euphemism lay gas chambers and crematoria, still in their experimental stages in Chelmno and Belzec. What had begun as shootings in forests would now become a production line of death. One of the officials, a man from the Ministry of Justice, raised a mild concern. He asked about mixed marriages, Jews married to Germans. How should those cases be handled? Heydrich's answer was chillingly casual. Each case will be examined individually, he said, but generally speaking, the bloodline determines the fate. The room nodded. It was biology disguised as law, murder disguised as order. They were not monsters foaming at the mouth. They were professionals dissecting human lives like accountants balancing a ledger. The conversation moved smoothly, efficiently. Someone asked about the logistics of transportation. Eichmann explained how trains would carry Jews from across Europe to camps in the general government, the Nazi-controlled part of Poland. He already had schedules drafted, capacities calculated, routes optimized. The railways were German precision at its finest. What no one said aloud was that these trains would be packed with men, women, and children, crushed together until they suffocated, their final destination hidden under the phrase resettlement. As the meeting continued, the men drank brandy and laughed between discussions. The mood was almost convivial. They debated percentages, exceptions, and procedures. They argued not about whether to kill, but about how best to do it. Some suggested sterilization for those of mixed heritage. Others proposed forced labor as a temporary measure before eventual liquidation. The tone remained polite, civilized, even bureaucratic. Yet every sentence carried the weight of millions of deaths. Outside, the snow began to fall again, covering the frozen lake in a layer of white. Inside, the fire burned lower, the air thick with smoke and the smell of leather and ink. The men continued to talk about numbers, transport quotas, and efficiency targets. The minutes of the meeting would later summarize it all in barely 15 pages. 15 pages that recorded the decision to erase an entire people. No orders were shouted, no documents signed in blood. Just nods, agreement, and the cold rhythm of administrative language. When the meeting ended, Heydrich thanked everyone for attending and reminded them of secrecy. The participants put on their coats, exchanged handshakes, and left. Some went back to their offices, others to dinner with their families. None would ever face justice in their lifetimes for what they had agreed to that morning. They had turned genocide into paperwork, and bureaucracy into a weapon. For the world outside, the villa at Wannsee meant nothing. The war raged on, cities burned, and armies clashed across continents. But in that quiet lakeside house, the Holocaust became official policy. The plan was no longer abstract. It had structure, direction, and approval. The final solution had been born not in screams or rage, but in calm discussion over cigars and coffee. The most horrifying idea in history had been made ordinary. In the weeks that followed, the machinery began to move faster. Orders went out to the SS and the German railways. Construction expanded at Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka. Auschwitz, originally a labor camp, began its transformation into a death factory. Engineers designed new gas chambers capable of killing thousands at once. The blueprints were drawn by men who considered themselves architects, not executioners. Every corner of the German state contributed: industrialists, chemists, railway clerks, bankers. Each task seemed small, each job routine, but together they built the most efficient killing system the world had ever seen. Eichmann, ever meticulous, worked day and night to coordinate transports. His notebooks filled with details, departure times, railcar capacities, fuel requirements. To him, the victims were cargo, the trains a logistical challenge. He would later say that he never hated the Jews. He simply followed orders. That was the essence of evil in its modern form. Not hatred, but indifference wrapped in obedience. As the trains began to roll, the impact of Wannsee spread across Europe like a silent wave. In Slovakia, Jews were rounded up under the guise of labor recruitment. In France, the Vichy government handed over thousands of men, women, and children to German custody. In the Netherlands, families were summoned to report for resettlement, their neighbors watching as they climbed into the trucks. In Greece, Hungary, Italy, Norway, everywhere the German shadow reached, the same story unfolded. Wannsee had made it possible to kill by routine. Even within the Nazi hierarchy, some felt unease. A few army officers, hardened by years on the front, questioned the morality of what they saw. But the system left no room for conscience. Dissent meant death, or worse, irrelevance. The men who had attended Wannsee returned to their desks, their pens now as deadly as rifles. Orders were written in neat handwriting, signed with official seals. The killing no longer required shouting. It moved quietly, efficiently, under the sound of trains. Heydrich himself would not live to see the full scale of what he had designed. In June 1942, Czech resistance fighters ambushed his car in Prague. He died days later of his wounds, hailed by Hitler as a martyr. But his death changed nothing. The plan he had forged at Wannsee was already unstoppable. His successor, Heinrich Himmler, took control with the same cold precision. Under his command, the extermination camps reached their peak efficiency. The SS measured success not in victories, but in numbers processed. Millions of people reduced to data points. The irony of Wannsee was that the men who planned genocide saw themselves as civilized. Many held doctorates, spoke multiple languages, quoted Goethe and Wagner. They saw their work not as barbarism, but as history's necessary evolution. They believed they were cleansing Europe of disease, building a new order from decay. In their minds, morality had been rewritten by ideology. Murder became duty. Compassion became weakness. And in that inversion of values, civilization itself turned against humanity. One of the participants, a man named Martin Luther from the Foreign Office, later kept a copy of the meeting's minutes in his files. It would survive the war and become evidence at Nuremberg. When prosecutors read it aloud, the courtroom fell silent. There were no photographs of victims, no films of atrocities, just words. But those words carried the weight of 6 million lives. They revealed that genocide had not begun in chaos, but in calm, deliberate planning. It had been discussed, debated, and agreed upon by men who saw themselves as patriots. In hindsight, the Wannsee Conference lasted barely 90 minutes. 90 minutes to decide the fate of an entire people. 90 minutes to turn centuries of prejudice into industrial murder. But in those 90 minutes, humanity crossed a line it could never uncross. The Holocaust had moved from ideology to implementation, from hatred to policy. The world's most advanced nation had transformed bureaucracy into genocide, efficiency into evil. Outside the villa, the lake remained frozen, the snow untouched. Birds crossed the sky, indifferent to the decisions made below. Servants cleaned the conference room, removing the glasses and papers, resetting the table for the next event. By evening, the villa was silent again, its windows reflecting the pale winter light. The men who had met there went back to their offices, their lives, their families. They told themselves they were only following orders, only serving their country. But they had written death into the language of the state. In the months that followed, the trains multiplied, the chimneys began to smoke, and the world tilted toward darkness. Every deportation, every execution, every burning body traced its shadow back to that quiet house by the lake. The villa still stands today, its walls smooth and white, its gardens peaceful. But if you listen closely, the silence seems heavy, as if it remembers. The laughter, the clinking of glasses, the soft rustle of papers being signed. All of it echoes still, a reminder that history's greatest crimes are not always born in screams. Sometimes, they begin in rooms where men speak softly, where the snow falls gently outside, and where the words chosen are polite enough to hide the end of the world. Chapter 8. Operation Reinhard. The death factories begin. The trains began arriving before dawn, their metal wheels shrieking through the mist. From the distance, they sounded like any other transport, but those who had lived long enough to see one knew better. Inside the sealed cattle cars, hundreds of people gasped for air, their hands pressed against the wooden slats, their voices hoarse from thirst. The smell was unbearable: sweat, urine, fear. Mothers clutched their children close, whispering prayers in languages the guards could not understand. When the doors finally opened, they were met not by work supervisors, but by men in black uniforms, barking orders, surrounded by barbed wire and the faint hum of machinery. The place had a name, Belzec, but its purpose was simpler. It existed to erase. Operation Reinhard was the most secret, most efficient, and most devastating phase of the Holocaust. It was the Nazis' plan to exterminate the Jews of occupied Poland, a project that turned killing into a process so organized it could be measured by train schedules and fuel consumption. Its architects were Reinhard Heydrich, whose death in Prague lent the operation his name, and Heinrich Himmler, who ensured it would be carried out with absolute precision. The commandants chosen to lead it, men like Christian Wirth, Franz Stangl, and Kurt Franz, were veterans of the T4 euthanasia program, where the Nazis had perfected the art of killing the disabled under the guise of mercy. Operation Reinhard was their next experiment, and this time the scale was monstrous. Construction on the death camps began in late 1941. 3 sites were chosen: Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka, all hidden in the forests of eastern Poland, close to railway lines but far from the eyes of the world. They were small, almost deceptively so. There were no vast barracks, no industrial smokestacks. Each was barely the size of a few football fields. But within those fences, over 1.5 million people would die in less than 2 years. Efficiency was everything. The camps were not built to hold prisoners for long. They were designed to kill them within hours of arrival. The first to open was Belzec. It began as a pilot project, an experiment in large-scale killing. When the first transport arrived in March 1942, the victims were told they would be bathed and disinfected before being assigned to work. They were led into a long wooden building with doors that locked from the outside. Pipes ran along the walls, connected not to water, but to the exhaust of a diesel engine. When the motor roared to life, the screams began. The victims clawed at the walls, gasping for air that no longer existed. Within 30 minutes, there was silence. The doors opened, and the bodies were dragged out by prisoners known as the Sonderkommando, men forced to work under threat of their own deaths. They removed gold teeth, cut hair, and piled corpses into pits. Then they waited for the next train. The camp staff recorded the results like engineers noting a successful test. The process worked, but could be improved. The engine was replaced with a larger one for faster results. The chambers were expanded. The pits were dug deeper. The Nazis have found their method. Himmler visited Belzec personally, walking the grounds with the pride of a man inspecting a factory. He congratulated the commandant on his efficiency and ordered the system replicated at 2 new sites, Sobibor and Treblinka. Sobibor opened in May 1942 under the command of Franz Stangl, a man whose calm demeanor concealed absolute obedience. Like Belzec, Sobibor had a false train station complete with signs, a clock, and a reception platform. Everything was designed to maintain the illusion of relocation. Prisoners were told to leave their luggage on the platform, labeled carefully for later return. Signs pointed to showers. They were stripped of their clothes and driven into the gas chambers, naked, terrified, and surrounded by guards who laughed as they worked. Within an hour of arrival, almost every person on the transport was dead. Only a handful were spared. Young men and women selected for labor in the camp itself, sorting belongings, removing corpses, maintaining the machinery of death. Their survival was temporary. Treblinka, the third and largest of the Operation Reinhard camps, began operation in July 1942. If Belzec was the prototype and Sobibor the refinement, Treblinka was the final model, a factory built for mass extermination on an unimaginable scale. It stood less than 50 miles from Warsaw, where the largest Jewish ghetto in Europe still clung to existence. When the deportations began, train after train left Warsaw daily, each carrying thousands of men, women, and children packed so tightly that many died before reaching the camp. The SS called it resettlement. The victims called it what it was, the end. Upon arrival, the process was immediate. The new arrivals were greeted by an SS officer who spoke politely, assuring them that everything was in order. "You will be taken to the showers," he would say. "Your possessions will be returned afterward." The deception was deliberate, designed to prevent panic. The prisoners were marched down a narrow, fenced pathway known cynically as the tube. At the end stood the gas chambers, stone buildings disguised as bathhouses, their walls thick, their floors sloped for easy cleaning. Diesel engines pumped carbon monoxide through metal pipes. Within minutes, the victims suffocated, their bodies convulsing and collapsing into piles. The guards waited for silence before opening the doors, dragging out the dead with hooks, washing down the floors, and preparing for the next group. It was not chaos. It was routine. The efficiency of Treblinka defied comprehension. At its peak, the camp could kill 12,000 people in a single day. The SS timed each operation down to the minute. Trains arrived every few hours, the bodies were removed, and the chambers were ready for the next group within half an hour. The staff recorded numbers, measured progress, and competed for higher output. The commandant, Franz Stangl, later admitted that he thought of his job like factory management. "My only interest," he said after the war, "was in how efficiently it could be done." Inside the camps, The few who were spared from immediate death lived in a nightmare without end. The Sonderkommando were forced to perform the most horrifying labor imaginable. They worked in teams, pulling bodies from the chambers, cutting hair, extracting teeth, and burning the corpses in open pits. The smell was everywhere, sweet, thick, inescapable. It clung to the skin, the hair, the breath. At night, the prisoners collapsed in exhaustion, knowing that tomorrow they might be among the next to die. Some prayed. Others no longer could. Yet even in this pit of despair, fragments of resistance began to form. In Sobibor, a small group of prisoners began a plan. They watched the guards, noted the routines, counted the weapons. They knew escape was nearly impossible, barbed wire, mines, dogs, but they also knew that doing nothing meant certain death. In October 1943, they rose up. Led by a Soviet Jewish officer named Alexander Petrovsky, the prisoners ambushed their guards with axes and knives, seizing weapons and cutting the phone lines. Chaos erupted. Flames spread through the camp. About 300 prisoners made it out of the gate before the machine guns opened fire. Only 50 would survive the war. But for one brief moment, the victims of Sobibor turned their prison into a battlefield. Treblinka, too, saw rebellion. In August 1943, the prisoners set the camp on fire, destroyed machinery, and tried to break through the fences. Most were killed, but their uprising forced the SS to abandon the camp soon after. The Nazis razed Treblinka to the ground, planted crops over the ashes, and left a farmhouse to disguise what had been there. They wanted to erase not just the people, but the evidence that such a place had ever existed. By the end of 1943, Operation Reinhard had achieved its grim purpose. Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka had collectively murdered over 1.5 million Jews from Poland, Czechoslovakia, Austria, and beyond. The scale of killing had outpaced even the Nazis' expectations. The ghettos of Warsaw, Lublin, Krakow, and others were emptied, their inhabitants reduced to ash. The SS documented the results with chilling pride. They calculated the value of gold teeth, jewelry, and clothing taken from the victims. They tallied the profits from confiscated property. The genocide was not only ideological, it was profitable. The plunder from Operation Reinhard helped finance the war and enrich those who ran it. The operations command structure was dismantled as its purpose was completed. Christian Wirth was transferred to Italy, where he continued his work on anti-partisan operations, spreading the methods of mass killing to new fronts. Franz Stangl was sent to command Sobibor and later Treblinka, overseeing the deaths of hundreds of thousands before escaping after the war. Heinrich Himmler praised his subordinates for their difficult but glorious duty, calling the extermination of the Jews a moral burden borne by the strong. It was the ultimate inversion of morality, murder as virtue, pity as weakness. For the survivors, the memory of Operation Reinhard was carved into their bones. They spoke of the sound of engines starting, of children crying for water, of guards singing as they killed. One survivor from Sobibor described the moment before entering the gas chamber. "I remember the smell of pine trees. I thought, how beautiful, and then I realized it would be the last thing I ever saw." Another from Treblinka recalled seeing mountains of shoes, suitcases, and hair, realizing that each belonged to someone who would never come back. The Nazis tried to hide everything as the tide of war turned. They exhumed mass graves and burned the bodies, scattering the ashes across the fields. They destroyed records, dismantled camps, and silenced witnesses. But the earth itself refused to forget. After the war, when investigators dug through the sites, they found bones, teeth, fragments of clothing. They found the outlines of gas chambers beneath the soil, the remains of foundations built by slave labor. The truth could not be buried. Operation Reinhard was more than a campaign of murder. It was the point where the Holocaust became fully industrial. The killing was no longer a byproduct of war. It was the war. Every train that left a ghetto, every document stamped in an office, every order signed by a man in uniform served a single, unified purpose: total extermination. The process was so efficient, so mechanical, that it stripped death of all meaning. People became numbers, bodies became fuel, and morality was reduced to silence. In Berlin, Himmler presented the results to Hitler as a triumph. He called it a necessary cleansing, a victory for the German people. Hitler listened without emotion, nodding occasionally, satisfied that the Jewish question was being solved. Outside their world of paperwork and statistics, the real consequences lay scattered across the fields of Poland. Ash in the soil, bones beneath the roots, names erased from memory. By the time the last transports ceased, the population of Polish Jewry, the largest in Europe, had been almost entirely annihilated. The ghettos were gone, their walls crumbled, their streets empty. Entire cultures, languages, and histories had vanished. Operation Reinhard had not just killed people, it had killed centuries of life. Yet even as the camps fell silent, the killing did not stop. Auschwitz, already functioning as a labor camp, now became the central hub of extermination. The methods perfected in Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka were transferred there on a larger scale. Gas chambers were built of concrete, the engines replaced by Zyklon B, a chemical weapon that could murder thousands in minutes. The ashes of Operation Reinhard fed directly into the fires of Auschwitz. The men who designed Operation Reinhard believed they were creating a solution, an end. But what they truly created was a legacy of horror that outlived them all. Their camps no longer exist, but the ground remembers. The air still whispers their names: Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka, like ghosts that refuse to be forgotten. The trains that once brought death to their gates are gone, their tracks rusted and overgrown. But the echoes remain, the hiss of steam, the cry of a child, the distant hum of an engine that once turned air into poison. Operation Reinhard was not only the center of the Holocaust, it was its blueprint, its engine, its soul. It was the point where efficiency replaced empathy, where civilization turned against itself, and where the question of what humans are capable of answering became too terrifying to ask. When the last of the ashes settled, when the last engine was silent, and the last pit was filled, the world was left with an unthinkable truth: that this had not been the work of monsters, but of men. Ordinary men who built railways, drew blueprints, and followed orders. The death factories had ended, but the lesson remained, that civilization is only ever a few decisions away from barbarism, and that the machinery of hate, once built, never truly stops humming. It merely waits for silence, for indifference, for the right words spoken in the right room, to begin again. Chapter 9. Auschwitz, the epicenter of death. At dawn, the fog settled thick over the Polish plains, hiding the chimneys that rose like blackened fingers from the earth. The barbed wire glistened with frost, the watchtowers silent except for the distant echo of barking dogs. Trains crept through the mist, their steel wheels grinding against the frozen rails. Inside, the passengers clung to one another, shivering, their breath turning to vapor in the icy air. They had been traveling for days with no food, no water, no idea where they were going. The smell reached them before the sight of it, the acrid stench of burning that hung permanently over the horizon. Then, through the fog, the sign appeared, iron letters arching over the gate. Arbeit mocked free. Work sets you free. It was a lie so cruel, so deliberate, that even the wind seemed to mock it. This was Auschwitz, the final destination for millions, the beating heart of humanity's darkest creation. Auschwitz was not one camp, but a vast network, a world unto itself. It began as a small detention center in 1940 for Polish political prisoners, but under the command of Heinrich Himmler, it grew into the largest complex of death in the Nazi Empire. It was divided into three main camps: Auschwitz I, the administrative core; Auschwitz II, Birkenau, the extermination center; and Auschwitz III, Monowitz, a massive forced labor site for the German chemical company IG Farben. Surrounding them were more than 40 subcamps, connected by rail lines and guarded by thousands of SS officers. From above, it looked like an industrial city. From the ground, it was hell made efficient. When the trains arrived, the process began immediately. SS men in crisp uniforms shouted orders as prisoners tumbled out of the cattle cars. Floodlights illuminated the platform, revealing rows of barbed wire and towers, the smoke curling above like gray ghosts. The air was thick with the smell of decay. Families were separated at once. Men to one side, women and children to another. Luggage was left behind, carefully tagged, as if it would be returned later. Mothers clutched infants. Fathers called out names that disappeared into the night. The confusion lasted only minutes before the command came, left or right. One direction led to the camp. The other led straight to death. The selection process was swift and mechanical. SS doctors stood by, pointing casually as prisoners filed past. Joseph Mengele, the camp's infamous physician, was known for his charming smile and calm voice as he condemned thousands to die with a flick of his wrist. Those deemed fit for labor, mostly young men and women, were sent to registration. The rest, the elderly, the sick, the mothers with children, were told they were going to take a shower. They walked unknowingly toward the gas chambers, guided by guards who spoke kindly, even reassuringly. It was part of the deception. The Nazis wanted order, not panic. Inside the so-called undressing rooms, prisoners were instructed to leave their clothes neatly on hooks, to remember their numbers for when they returned. Some still believed it was true. Others sensed what was coming, but could not flee. When the doors closed behind them, the lights went out. A moment of silence. Then the hiss of gas began to fill the room. Zyklon B pellets, dropped through openings in the ceiling, released cyanide vapors that killed within minutes. The screams were muffled by the thick walls. The guards waited until the noise stopped. Then, wearing gas masks, they opened the doors to find piles of bodies. Families locked together, hands clawing at the ceiling, children crushed under adults in their final terror. The bodies were dragged to the crematoria by prisoners known as the Sonderkommando, men forced to work at the edge of the abyss. Their task was to untangle the dead, remove gold teeth, shear hair, and feed the corpses into furnaces. The fire never stopped. Smoke rose day and night, carrying the ashes of the murdered into the sky. The flames reflected off the windows of nearby villages, where people pretended not to see. The earth itself grew gray, the soil soaked with human remains. In the ponds and rivers near Birkenau, the ashes still drifted long after the war. Auschwitz was a place where everything was calculated, measured, and recorded. Nothing was wasted. The Nazis cataloged gold, jewelry, watches, even the hair of their victims, in warehouses nicknamed Kaneda, because they overflowed with stolen wealth. Mountains of shoes, suitcases, and glasses filled the rooms. Each object was labeled, sorted, and shipped back to Germany. The efficiency was monstrous. Death was not chaos. It was order perfected. Every arrival was scheduled, every corpse accounted for. Even the smoke had a purpose, to erase what had been done. Life for those spared immediate death was a slow disintegration. Prisoners woke before dawn to the sound of whistles and barking dogs. Roll calls lasted for hours, no matter the weather. Men collapsed in the snow, frozen where they stood. The guards laughed as they beat them for not standing straight. Breakfast was black coffee made from burnt grain. Lunch was watery soup. Dinner was a crust of bread, often stolen or fought over. Disease spread quickly. Typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis. The smell of sickness mixed with the constant stench of burning flesh. The living envied the dead. Work in Auschwitz meant survival, but only for a while. Prisoners labored 12 hours a day hauling bricks, building barracks, or digging trenches. At the Monowitz camp, thousands worked for IG Farben's Buna factory, producing synthetic rubber for the German war effort. Those who collapsed were beaten or shot. Others were sent back to Birkenau for special treatment, a phrase that had come to mean only one thing. The Nazi ideology of efficiency was everywhere. People were worked until they could no longer work, Then they were turned into smoke. Among the prisoners, a fragile underground resistance existed. They smuggled notes, documented crimes, and shared scraps of food. Some risked everything to hide evidence, burying photographs and records so the world would one day know the truth. One such effort was led by the Sonderkommando. Knowing they were doomed, they secretly photographed the process of extermination, hiding the film in the ground near the crematoria. Their message to the world was simple: remember us. In the middle of this machinery of death, Joseph Mengele conducted his experiments. He saw himself as a scientist, but his laboratory was horror. He obsessed over twins, convinced they held the secret to racial purity. Children were measured, injected, dissected. He dyed their eyes with chemicals, amputated limbs without anesthesia, and murdered them when he was done. Survivors remembered his calm demeanor, his almost gentle tone. He would hand children candy one moment, then send them to their deaths the next. He was the embodiment of what Auschwitz had become, a place where evil had learned to wear a human smile. The SS at Auschwitz lived comfortably, their homes just outside the fences. They attended concerts, raised families, and hosted dinner parties while the crematoria burned within view. Wives of officers complained about smoke ruining their laundry. Guards drank and played cards at night, their laughter mingling with the faint cries from the barracks. One survivor later said, "It was like living next to hell while the devils danced above it." As the war dragged on, the number of victims grew staggering. Jews from every corner of Europe, France, Hungary, Greece, Italy, the Netherlands, were brought to Auschwitz. The trains arrived day and night, each one delivering thousands. The rhythm was relentless. In 1944 alone, during the deportation of Hungarian Jews, over 400,000 people were murdered at Birkenau in less than 2 months. The chimneys poured black smoke that blotted out the sun. The surrounding villages called it the rain of ashes. The sky itself seemed to weep. The camp administration kept meticulous records, though they never recorded the dead by name. Each prisoner was given a number tattooed on their arm, their identity replaced by digits. The first few thousand numbers were inked on the chest. Later, the left forearm. It became the symbol of Auschwitz, proof that individuality could be erased by bureaucracy. For many, it was the last thing the Nazis gave them before taking everything else. By late 1944, as the Red Army advanced from the east, the Nazis began to destroy evidence of their crimes. Crematoria were blown up, documents burned, mass graves exhumed and incinerated. Prisoners were forced to dig up bodies, pile them onto pyres, and watch them burn. The air was thick with ash and panic. Himmler ordered that Auschwitz be evacuated. Its surviving inmates would be marched westward to other camps. It was another lie. Those evacuations became death marches. In the freezing winter, tens of thousands were forced to walk hundreds of miles through snow and ice, starving, barefoot, collapsing along the road. Guards shot anyone who fell behind. The path from Auschwitz to Germany became a trail of corpses. When the Red Army reached Auschwitz on January 27, 1945, they found a silence that felt impossible. The gates still stood, the barbed wire sagged, and the snow covered everything in white. The soldiers walked through the camp, rifles ready, expecting resistance. Instead, they found only ghosts. Around 7,000 prisoners remained, skeletal, sick, barely alive. They stared at their liberators in disbelief. For them, freedom was as unreal as the horror they had endured. The soldiers gave them bread, water, blankets. Some survivors ate too quickly and died, their bodies unable to bear food after months of starvation. The barracks were filled with corpses frozen in bunks. The air still smelled of burning. In the warehouses, the Soviets discovered mountains of personal belongings, hundreds of thousands of men's suits, women's dresses, piles of human hair packed into sacks for use in German factories. There were children's shoes, dolls, and photographs. Each object was a story that would never be told. They also found the ruins of 4 giant crematoria, their walls blackened, their ovens still warm. It was evidence of a crime so vast that words could not contain it. In the days that followed, the survivors began to speak. Slowly, painfully, they told their stories to the soldiers and doctors. They spoke of the selections, the gas chambers, the beatings, the endless hunger. Some had not said a word in months, their voices raw with emotion. Others could only weep. They had no language for what they had witnessed. The liberators, hardened by years of war, found themselves overwhelmed. One Soviet officer later wrote, "We had seen battlefields, but never anything like this. The world will not believe us." Auschwitz became the symbol of the Holocaust because it contained everything: the ideology, the machinery, the deception, and the silence. It was where modern civilization turned its power inward, using science and engineering not to build, but to destroy. It was proof that evil does not require chaos. It can thrive in order, in rules, in efficiency. It was a mirror held up to humanity, and what it reflected was unbearable. After the war, during the Nuremberg Trials, the name Auschwitz appeared again and again. Survivors testified, photographs were shown, and documents were read aloud. The defendants called it fabrication, propaganda, exaggeration. But the evidence was irrefutable. The world saw the tattooed arms, the piles of bones, the haunted faces of those who had lived through it. The truth was written into the ashes of Birkenau. In the decades that followed, Auschwitz became a memorial. The fences remain, the barracks preserved, the gate still standing with its cruel inscription. Visitors walk through the ruins in silence, tracing the paths of those who never returned. The air feels heavy, as if the past has never left. Guides speak softly, their voices trembling as they describe what once was. No one leaves unchanged. Yet even now, there are moments when the reality of Auschwitz seems too immense to grasp. How could a place built by human hands become so devoid of humanity? How could engineers, doctors, and ordinary men participate in such cruelty and still go home to their families? The answers are buried somewhere beneath the ash and snow. Perhaps the truth is that Auschwitz was not an accident. It was a reflection of what happens when hate, obedience, and indifference combine. The ashes of over 1 million people rest beneath that soil, among them more than 900,000 Jews, along with Poles, Roma, Soviet prisoners, and countless others. Their voices were silenced, but their memory endures in the rusted rails, the crumbling chimneys, the faint echo of footsteps on frozen ground. The wind that blows through Auschwitz today carries more than cold, it carries warning. A whisper to every generation that follows. Remember what happened here. Remember what people are capable of when they stop seeing others as human. The fires of Auschwitz burned out long ago, but their smoke still hangs over history. It rises whenever hatred finds a home, whenever silence replaces conscience. The gate still stands open, its words mocking, its meaning inverted. Arbeit mocked free. For those who passed beneath it, there was no freedom, only the certainty that the world had forgotten them. And for those who walk beneath it today, there is only the echo of that promise, and the unending question it leaves behind: how did we let it happen? Chapter 10. The Deception of the Red Cross, their Scienstadt. The gates of their Scienstadt stood open on a summer morning in 1944, the cobblestone streets swept, the windows polished, and the air strangely still. Flowers had been planted along the main square, new curtains hung in the houses, and a small orchestra tuned their instruments under the soft light of the sun. The guards watched from the corners, their uniforms spotless, their expressions rehearsed. In the distance, the sound of a train faded away. Everything looked calm, civilized, almost beautiful. But beneath the calm, the air was heavy with fear. The people who walked through the street smiled because they had been told to. The children laughed because they had been rehearsed to. The whole town had become a stage, and the audience was on its way. The Red Cross was coming, and the Nazis were ready for their performance. Their Scienstadt, or Terezin, as it was known in Czech, had once been a quiet garrison town, built in the 18th century by Emperor Joseph II. When the Nazis occupied Czechoslovakia, they saw in it a convenient prison, isolated, enclosed, easy to control. In 1941, it became a ghetto and transit camp, a holding point between life and death. From there, tens of thousands of Jews from across Europe were deported to Auschwitz and other extermination camps. But their Scienstadt was also something else, something unique in the machinery of the Holocaust. It was propaganda made real, a model ghetto designed to deceive the world. The Nazis needed a lie. By 1943, rumors of mass exterminations were spreading through neutral countries and allied governments. Reports smuggled out by escapees and resistance networks described gas chambers and crematoria. The world was beginning to suspect the truth. To counter these claims, Heinrich Himmler and Joseph Goebbels devised a plan. They would turn their Scienstadt into a living illusion, a place that looked like a functioning Jewish settlement under Nazi protection. They would stage it so perfectly that no one could believe the stories of death camps. It would be their masterpiece of deceit. To prepare for the inspection, the SS transformed the ghetto overnight. Streets were cleaned, new signs were painted, and facades repaired. The starving prisoners were given extra rations for a few days to make them look healthier. The sick and emaciated were hidden away in barracks outside the inspection route. Those who were too weak to stand were deported to Auschwitz ahead of time, their absence explained as resettlement. In their place, the Nazis brought in artists, musicians, and teachers from other camps, people whose presence would make the town seem vibrant and cultured. It was all a performance, carefully orchestrated by Adolf Eichmann himself, the architect of Jewish deportation. When the Red Cross delegation arrived on June 23, 1944, the transformation was complete. The visitors entered a town that seemed peaceful and self-governed. Children played in the courtyard. A cafe served coffee and pastries. An elderly couple strolled down the street arm in arm. The prisoners bowed politely as the inspectors passed, smiling despite the dread that burned inside them. They knew what this was. They had been ordered to act as if everything was fine, to perform normal life while death waited at the edge of the walls. The delegation followed a carefully planned route. They were shown a school where children drew pictures of houses and flowers. They visited a library filled with neatly arranged books, a hospital where patients pretended to be receiving real care, and a park where benches gleamed under the sun. The SS officers walked beside them, explaining that their Scienstadt was a retirement colony for elderly Jews and intellectuals, a humanitarian project, proof of German generosity. The inspectors nodded, taking notes. None of them were allowed to wander off the path. None were permitted to see the overcrowded barracks or the transports leaving in the night. The most haunting part of the deception was the music. To impress the visitors, the Nazis organized a concert by the Scienstadt Orchestra, composed entirely of Jewish prisoners. They played Verdi's Requiem and compositions by Jewish musicians, their fingers trembling on the instruments, their eyes hollow with exhaustion. For one brief moment, the ghetto came alive with sound, violins, cellos, voices rising in harmony against the silence of fear. The inspectors applauded. To them, it was proof of culture and normalcy. To the performers, it was survival. Many of those musicians would be sent to Auschwitz within weeks. The lie worked. The Red Cross report described their Scienstadt as a self-administered Jewish settlement, with good living conditions. The delegates praised the cleanliness, the cultural life, and the supposed respect the prisoners received. No mention was made of starvation, executions, or deportations. The Nazis had succeeded in convincing the world that the stories of mass murder were exaggerated. The deception bought them time to continue killing without interference, time to finish the final solution in silence. For the prisoners, the price of that deception was unbearable. They had been forced to clean their prison for the camera, to smile for their oppressors, to pretend that death wasn't waiting beyond the walls. Many called their Scienstadt the waiting room of Auschwitz. It was the last stop before oblivion. Trains left regularly, carrying thousands eastward to their deaths. Every departure was announced as resettlement to work camps. Every family hoped they might be going somewhere better. None returned. Life in their Scienstadt, even outside the propaganda facade, was a slow starvation. The population reached over 50,000 in a space meant for less than 7,000. Hunger ruled everything. People traded jewelry for a piece of bread, clothes for a few potatoes. Disease spread quickly: typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis. There were no proper medicines, no sanitation, no escape. Yet, amid this despair, something extraordinary happened. The prisoners created a world of art, music, and learning, determined to preserve their humanity even as the walls closed in. Children near Scienstadt attended secret schools taught by artists, poets, and scholars. They wrote poems and painted pictures of butterflies, trees, and skies they could no longer see. Their art, hidden from the guards, was a language of hope. One child wrote, "I never saw another butterfly." Another drew a picture of a sun rising over a field of flowers, signing it with initials that would later be found on a transport list to Auschwitz. These drawings survived in boxes buried beneath the floorboards, discovered after the war. They are among the few surviving voices of innocence from the Holocaust. The adults also fought to keep culture alive. There were concerts, lectures, and theater performances, all organized in secret. Writers composed plays that mocked the absurdity of their situation. Painters captured the faces of the dying, preserving them in sketches hidden from the SS. Doctors documented the effects of starvation, hoping their records might one day serve as evidence. They called it spiritual resistance, the refusal to let their captors strip them of meaning. In the middle of death, they created beauty, and in doing so, they defied annihilation. But the illusion of their Scienstadt could not last forever. After the Red Cross visit, the Nazis decided to use the ghetto for one final propaganda project: a film. The director was a Czech Jew named Kurt Jaran, a famous actor before the war, forced to make a movie that portrayed their Scienstadt as a paradise. The SS promised him freedom in exchange for his cooperation. He agreed, perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of hope. The cameras rolled. Prisoners were ordered to smile as they played chess, shopped in fake stores, and attended concerts. The film showed children dancing, families eating together, workers cheerfully at their tasks. It was titled "The Führer Gives a City to the Jews." When filming ended, Jaran and nearly everyone who appeared in it were deported to Auschwitz and murdered. Only fragments of the film survived, ghosts of a lie that cost thousands their lives. By the end of 1944, the war was turning against Germany. The Red Army advanced from the east, the Allies from the west. As the Reich crumbled, the Nazis accelerated their killing. Transports from their Scienstadt to Auschwitz continued until the gas chambers themselves were destroyed to hide evidence of the crimes. In early 1945, as the front drew closer, the SS began evacuating other camps, sending thousands of prisoners on death marches toward their Scienstadt. The ghetto swelled with new arrivals, skeletons wrapped in rags, their eyes empty. Typhus broke out again. Death moved through the streets like a shadow that could not be escaped. When the Red Army liberated their Scienstadt on May 8, 1945, they found over 13,000 dead and thousands more dying. The survivors were too weak to stand. The once carefully staged model ghetto was now a graveyard. The flowers that had been planted for the cameras were dead, the orchestra silenced, the streets littered with bodies. The illusion had ended, and the truth stood naked in the sunlight. In the months that followed, the world learned what their Scienstadt had really been: a weapon of deception in a war against truth. The Red Cross, humiliated by its failure, admitted it had been misled. The survivors testified about the lies they had been forced to live. They spoke of rehearsing smiles for the inspectors, of being told to hide their sick and dying, of watching trains leave for Auschwitz the day after the cameras stopped rolling. Their testimonies exposed not only the cruelty of the Nazis, but the fragility of belief, the ease with which people could be made to doubt the obvious when the lie was wrapped in civility. Their Scienstadt became a symbol of manipulation, a warning that evil often wears a mask. It showed that genocide could coexist with manners, that mass murder could be hidden behind flowers and music. It revealed how easily the world could be fooled when it wanted to be. And yet, it was also a place of resilience. The art, the music, the poetry, all of it survived. The children's drawings, the secret diaries, the songs, they became testimony that even in the darkest corners, humanity refused to vanish completely. Today, the walls of their Scienstadt still stand. The barracks have been restored, the cemetery carefully tended. Visitors walk through the same streets the Red Cross once admired, but the silence feels heavier now. The empty rooms whisper of the lives that once filled them, the laughter rehearsed, the smiles forced, the prayers whispered when the guards weren't listening. The ghosts of the children are everywhere, their drawings now framed behind glass, their poems etched into stone. The lie that once fooled the world is gone, but the truth remains, carved into every brick. The story of their Scienstadt is not just about deception. It is about complicity, the ease with which the civilized world accepted comfort over confrontation. It is about how evil can dress itself in beauty, how a melody can hide a scream. And it is about those who, in the midst of it all, refuse to forget what it meant to be human. The Red Cross came to their Scienstadt to see a model community. What they found was a performance. What they missed was the truth that stood in plain sight. The smell of death behind painted doors, the silence of the trains leaving at night, the eyes of children who already knew that paradise was a lie. When the sun sets over their Scienstadt today, the light catches the river and the red roofs glow. For a moment, it looks almost peaceful. But in that quiet beauty lies a reminder of how fragile truth can be, how easily the world can be blinded by what it wants to see. Their Scienstadt was built on illusion, sustained by fear, and exposed by memory. And though its walls no longer hold prisoners, they still hold a warning that echoes across time. The moment we begin to look away, the moment we choose comfort over conscience, the stage will be set again, and the performance will begin anew. Chapter 11. The Resistance and the Uprisings. The night was silent except for the faint hum of a generator and the sound of boots crunching on gravel. Somewhere in the darkness, a hand tightened around a piece of stolen wire. A whispered command passed from one trembling mouth to another. The air was thick with smoke, fear, and the smell of earth soaked in rain. Beneath the barbed wire fences of Treblinka, Sobibor, and Auschwitz, something impossible was about to happen. The condemned were going to rise. They had no weapons, no hope of survival, and no illusions about what awaited them. But in that moment, they had something stronger than fear. They had the decision to die on their feet rather than live on their knees. For years, the Nazi system had been built to crush resistance. Every rebellion, every whisper of defiance, had been silenced with brutality. The ghettos, the camps, the labor colonies, all had been designed to break the human spirit as much as the body. Yet even in the face of annihilation, rebellion flickered like a candle that refused to be snuffed out. From the cramped ghettos of Warsaw to the forests of Belarus, from the gas chambers of Treblinka to the snow-covered fields of Poland, the oppressed found ways to fight back. Their victories were measured not in territory, but in dignity, not in survival, but in the act of refusing to surrender their humanity. The story of resistance during the Holocaust began not with guns, but with words, with the decision to remember, to record, to preserve truth in a world built on lies. In the ghettos, underground movements formed secretly. In Warsaw, a historian named Emanuel Ringelblum created the Oneg Shabbat archive, collecting diaries, photographs, and testimonies from those trapped inside. He and his collaborators buried milk cans filled with documents beneath the ghetto's ruins, believing that even if they did not live, their truth might. When the Germans destroyed the ghetto, they did not know that beneath the ashes lay history itself, waiting to be unearthed. Those who fought with words understood that sometimes resistance meant ensuring the world would one day know what had been done. But as the killings escalated and the ghettos were liquidated, words no longer felt enough. The walls that confined them became both prison and fortress, and from their rubble, the first great uprising was born. The Warsaw Ghetto uprising in April 1943 was the largest act of Jewish armed resistance during the Holocaust. It began with whispers, rumors of deportations that no longer led to labor camps, but to death. The young fighters of the Jewish Combat Organization, led by Mordecai Anielewicz, knew the truth. They had seen the transports to Treblinka. They knew that resettlement meant extermination. So they decided to fight. They smuggled weapons into the ghetto, pistols hidden in loaves of bread, grenades made from stolen materials, rifles bought from sympathetic Polish resistance members. When the Germans came to begin the final liquidation, the fighters were ready. On April 19th, the eve of Passover, the SS entered with tanks and flamethrowers. They expected submission. Instead, gunfire erupted from the windows, from the rooftops, from the sewers below. The Jews of Warsaw, starving and outnumbered, fought back with everything they had. The first German units were forced to retreat, leaving behind their dead. For the first time, the invincible Nazi machine had met resistance from those it had already written off as ghosts. The battle lasted for nearly a month. Street by street, the ghetto burned. The Germans destroyed entire blocks with fire and explosives. The air was black with smoke, filled with the screams of the wounded and the crackle of flames devouring the wooden houses. Yet, even as the buildings collapsed, the fighters refused to surrender. They retreated underground, fighting from the sewers and cellars. Mordecai Anielewicz, only 24 years old, led from a bunker at 18 Mila Street. When it became clear that the battle was lost, he and his comrades chose death over capture, taking their own lives. His last letter, found after the war, read, "The dream of my life has become true. I have lived to see Jewish defense in the ghetto in all its greatness and glory." The uprising ended in May, when the SS demolished the Great Synagogue of Warsaw as a final symbol of victory. But the victory was hollow. The Germans had crushed the rebellion, yet the myth of Jewish passivity had been shattered forever. The fighters of Warsaw had shown that even in the heart of hell, resistance was possible. The spirit of Warsaw spread like fire across the camps and ghettos. In Białystok, Vilna, and Krakow, smaller uprisings flared. In the forests of Eastern Europe, partisans formed hidden communities. They were Jews who had escaped the ghettos and camps, surviving in the wilderness with homemade weapons, joining forces with local resistance movements. They sabotaged railways, ambushed German patrols, and rescued others from deportation. Some were teenagers, others elderly, but all shared a single oath. If death was inevitable, it would not come without a fight. One of the most famous groups, the Bielski partisans, led by 4 brothers from Belarus, saved over 1,200 Jews, creating a hidden village in the forest that became known as Jerusalem in the woods. They built schools, workshops, and defenses, proving that survival itself could be a form of defiance. Inside the extermination camps, where hope was meant to die, rebellion was almost unimaginable. Yet even there, sparks of resistance ignited. In Sobibor, prisoners spent months planning a revolt. Led by a Soviet Jewish officer named Alexander Petrovsky and Polish prisoner Leon Feldhendler, they carefully studied the routines of the guards, the positions of weapons, and the layout of the camp. They knew they had only one chance. On October 14th, 1943, they struck. Using knives, axes, and stolen guns, they killed 11 SS officers and cut the phone lines. Chaos erupted. Hundreds of prisoners stormed the gates, running through minefields and into the forest. Machine guns tore through the air. Many were killed, but around 50 survived to tell the world what had happened. The camp was soon dismantled, its grounds plowed over to hide the evidence. But the uprising at Sobibor stood as proof that even in the darkest corners of the Holocaust, defiance lived. A similar revolt occurred in Treblinka just 2 months earlier. There, the prisoners, many of them members of the Sonderkommando, forced to burn bodies, managed to steal weapons from the camp armory. On August 2nd, 1943, They set fire to buildings, attacked the guards, and tried to breach the fences. The uprising was brutally suppressed, but in the confusion, around 300 prisoners escaped. Only about 70 survived the war, but the revolt forced the Nazis to shut down Treblinka soon after. Its ashes were its own epitaph, written by those who refused to die in silence. Even in Auschwitz, where the machinery of death seemed absolute, rebellion found a way. The Sonderkommando there, knowing their own deaths were imminent, began smuggling gunpowder from a nearby munitions factory operated by female prisoners. Young women, Alla Gertner, Rosa Roboda, Esther Wajblum, and Regina Safferstage, risked everything to pass the powder grain by grain, hidden in scraps of cloth and hair. On October 7, 1944, the men used it to blow up Crematorium 4. They attacked the guards with hammers and stones, shouting, "Freedom or death," before being gunned down. All the women involved were tortured and executed, but their defiance became legend. The explosion they sparked was small compared to the vastness of Auschwitz, but in that act, they reclaimed their humanity. They proved that even surrounded by death, the human spirit could still burn. Resistance also took quieter forms. In countless towns and villages, individuals risked their lives to save others. The Danish people, when warned of impending deportations in 1943, organized a national rescue operation. In a matter of days, fishermen smuggled over 7,000 Jews across the Øresund Strait to neutral Sweden. In France, Italy, and the Netherlands, underground networks forged papers, hid families, and coordinated escapes. Priests, nuns, and farmers sheltered children in monasteries and barns. Some, like Oskar Schindler, used their positions inside the Nazi system to protect their workers. Schindler, a member of the Nazi Party, bribed officials and falsified records to save over 1,000 Jews in his factories. Others, like the Japanese diplomat Chun Sugihara, defied orders to issue transit visas, helping thousands flee to safety. Their courage was a flicker of light in a landscape of darkness. For every act of rebellion, the cost was terrible. The Nazis responded to resistance with collective punishment, executing families, burning villages, torturing prisoners for information. In the ghettos, any act of defiance, even possessing a weapon, meant death not just for the fighter, but for everyone around them. Yet despite this, people continued to resist. They smuggled food, taught children in secret, wrote poetry, prayed. Every act that affirmed life became a weapon against the system built to destroy it. What made this defiance even more remarkable was that it often came from people who knew they would not survive. They fought not for themselves, but for the dignity of their people, for the belief that someone, somewhere, would remember. When Alexander Petrovsky escaped Sobibor, he told those who stay behind, "Those who survive, tell the story. The world must know." That call echoed across the ruins of every ghetto and camp, carried by the few who lived to bear witness. The uprisings also exposed something the Nazis had never considered, that their victims were not passive, and that terror alone could not guarantee obedience. Each act of rebellion, no matter how small, fractured the illusion of control. It forced the perpetrators to confront the humanity of those they sought to dehumanize. It reminded them, even for a moment, that their victims could still choose how to die. For a regime built on domination, that was unbearable. After the war, the stories of resistance were slow to emerge. Many survivors felt guilt for having lived when so many others had not. Some were haunted by the question of whether they had done enough. But with time, their courage came to light. The Warsaw fighters were remembered not as doomed rebels, but as heroes who preserved the honor of a people condemned to extinction. The partisans who lived in the forests were celebrated for keeping alive the idea of Jewish resistance. The uprisings in Treblinka, Sobibor, and Auschwitz became symbols of the indestructible will to fight back, even when victory was impossible. Today, their stories are more than history. They are moral reckoning. They ask questions that still burn. What does it mean to resist when resistance is hopeless? What does courage look like when there is no chance of survival? What does it mean to be human in a world determined to erase you? The answers lie in the faces of those who fought with empty hands, who raised their fists against tanks, who sang songs in the darkness of the camps knowing it would be their last act. The resistance and uprisings of the Holocaust did not end the killing, but they reclaimed something even greater. They reclaimed the truth that the Nazis tried to bury, that the Jewish people were never helpless victims, that even in the face of extermination, they chose defiance over despair. Their weapons were few, their victories temporary, but their courage was eternal. When we speak of the Holocaust, we speak often of death, of numbers, of loss too vast to imagine. But hidden within that darkness are the moments when humanity refused to die. In the sewers of Warsaw, in the forests of Belarus, in the ashes of Auschwitz, the spirit of resistance lived on. It burned quietly, defiantly, reminding the world that even when everything else is taken, the choice to fight, to stand, to remember, to bear witness, is something no oppressor can ever destroy. And so, when the world asks what happened in those years, when it asks how people endured the unendurable, the answer lies not only in the horror, but in the fire that refused to go out. The fire that flickered in every uprising, every act of rebellion, every whispered word of defiance. It was the fire that said, even at the gates of death, we are still here. We will not be forgotten. Chapter 12. Liberation and the Long Road Home. The gates opened not with fanfare or vengeance, but with silence. It was January 27th, 1945, when Soviet soldiers entered Auschwitz. The snow lay deep, muffling every sound, and the air was thick with the smell of smoke and decay. The soldiers walked through the camp with rifles ready, expecting resistance, traps, snipers. What they found instead were shadows, figures in striped uniforms barely standing, their faces hollow, their eyes beyond tears. The dead were everywhere, in bunks, on the ground, frozen in the positions they had died in. The living were skeletal, their skin stretched tight over bone, their voices too weak to speak. For the soldiers, hardened by years of battle, this was something else entirely. This was not war. This was revelation. They had entered the edge of hell, and what they saw would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The liberation of the camps began in fragments, scattered across Europe, as the Allied armies advanced on all fronts. To the west, the Americans and British pushed through Germany and Austria, uncovering camps like Buchenwald, Dachau, and Bergen-Belsen. To the east, the Soviets freed Auschwitz, Majdanek, and countless smaller extermination sites. None of the liberators truly knew what they were about to find. Rumors of atrocities had reached them, but nothing, no report, no briefing, no story, could have prepared them for the reality. At first, many thought they had entered abandoned prisons or hospitals. Then the smell hit them, a thick, sweet, nauseating stench of death that clung to the air and skin. Piles of corpses filled the courtyards, some decomposed, others freshly executed. Barracks overflowed with survivors too weak to move, their eyes sunken, their voices trembling with disbelief. In Bergen-Belsen, British soldiers found over 13,000 unburied bodies and 30,000 survivors dying from starvation and typhus. The camp was a sea of the dead and the dying, indistinguishable from each other. One soldier described it as a world of the living dead. Another simply said, "This is what hell must look like." In Dachau, the Americans arrived to find train cars filled with bodies, frozen stiff, stacked like wood. The smell of human waste and rot hung thick in the spring air. When the soldiers entered the main camp, they found survivors crawling toward them on hands and knees, whispering in broken German and Yiddish, "Are you real?" Some kissed the boots of their liberators. Others collapsed where they stood, too weak to celebrate. Many did not live long enough to understand they had been freed. The scenes repeated themselves again and again. In Buchenwald, prisoners staggered out of barracks, some waving handmade flags. In Ravensbrück, the women's camp, the Soviets found tens of thousands of inmates, many mutilated by medical experiments. In Mauthausen, the Americans were met by a banner scrawled in shaky German. The Spaniards greet the liberators. The prisoners, speaking dozens of languages, cried and laughed at once, the emotions too large for their frail bodies to contain. For the liberators, the shock turned quickly to fury. Many soldiers broke down. Others turned their rage toward the guards they captured. At Dachau, American troops executed dozens of SS men on the spot after forcing them to see what they had done. In Belsen, British officers ordered the surviving guards to bury the bodies themselves, under armed watch. The once feared SS trembled as they carried corpses into mass graves, the same pits they had once filled with victims. The war was ending, but the reckoning had only begun. The survivors, however, faced a different kind of reckoning. Liberation was not the end of their suffering. It was the beginning of another struggle. They were free, but they were broken. Many weighed less than 70 pounds. Their skin was covered in sores, their teeth falling out, their stomachs unable to digest food. Allied doctors tried to feed them, but even kindness could kill. Many died after eating too quickly, their starved bodies unable to process nourishment. Disease spread rapidly through the camps: typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis. The liberators brought medicine, blankets, and water, but the scale of misery was overwhelming. Slowly, the survivors began to speak. At first, their voices were hesitant, as if they were unsure whether words could capture what they had seen. They told the soldiers about the gas chambers, the selections, the beatings, the endless hunger. They pointed to the crematoria and said, "That is where my family went." They dug through piles of shoes and clothes, searching for something familiar, something left of those who were gone. Many could not cry. Their grief was beyond tears. "We are free," one survivor said, but free for what? In the weeks that followed, the camps were transformed into emergency hospitals. Allied doctors worked around the clock to save the sick. At Belsen, the British burned down the entire camp to stop the spread of disease. The air was filled with smoke again, but this time it was the smoke of cleansing, not killing. Field kitchens were set up, soup distributed, clean clothes provided. For the first time in years, the survivors slept without fear of the midnight whistle, the roll call, the shout of rouse. Some slept for days without waking, their bodies finally surrendering to exhaustion. Yet for many, liberation came with a hollow echo. The war had taken everything: families, homes, names. They had no one to return to, no place to go. Entire communities had been erased. Cities like Warsaw and Vilna, once centers of Jewish life, were now piles of rubble and silence. Those who did return often found strangers living in their homes or faced hostility from neighbors who wanted to forget. "We came back," one survivor said, "but there was no back to come to." Displaced persons camps were established across Europe to house the millions uprooted by the war: Jews, Poles, Russians, and others who had survived forced labor or imprisonment. For the survivors of the Holocaust, these camps were limbo, neither home nor prison, but something in between. There they began the long, painful process of rebuilding their lives. They searched for lost relatives, pinned photographs to bulletin boards, wrote names on lists. Some were reunited with loved ones they thought dead. Others searched in vain. The air in the camps was thick with both joy and sorrow, with hope and despair entwined like vines around the same heart. In these displaced camps, life began again, fragile but determined. Marriages were held, babies born, schools reopened. Religious leaders held services for the dead, reciting prayers over the names of those who had no graves. Survivors gathered in circles at night, telling their stories to anyone who would listen. They spoke not for pity, but for remembrance, for the need to make the world hear. Some swore never to speak of it again. Others devoted the rest of their lives to ensuring that what had happened would never be forgotten. The Allied forces also faced the task of understanding what they had uncovered. Investigators collected evidence, took photographs, filmed the camps. The footage became some of the most haunting images in history. Rows of corpses, children staring at the camera with eyes too old for their faces, soldiers weeping as they carried bodies to graves. The liberators did not see themselves as heroes. They saw themselves as witnesses. They knew that one day the world would question, deny, or forget, and they wanted proof that this had been real. In Nuremberg, the evidence was presented to the world. Photographs of piles of shoes, lampshades made of human skin, ledgers detailing shipments of Zyklon B gas. Survivors testified in trembling voices, describing inhuman cruelty in calm, measured tones. The judges listened, horrified, as the words crimes against humanity entered history for the first time. The Nazi leaders, confronted with the reality of their crimes, denied, minimized, or claimed obedience to orders. But the proof was undeniable. The liberation of the camps had exposed the machinery of genocide, the cold, bureaucratic efficiency of evil. Still, for those who had lived through it, justice was a distant concept. No verdict could bring back the dead. No sentence could erase the nightmares. The liberation had freed their bodies, but their souls remained behind the barbed wire. For years, they would wake in the night, hearing phantom sirens, smelling the ghostly smoke of the crematoria. Some survivors tried to rebuild their lives in Europe. Others emigrated to Palestine, to America, to Australia. They carried their memories with them like scars that never healed. Many never spoke of what they had endured, burying the past deep inside, believing silence was the only way to live. Others spoke endlessly, unable to stop, haunted by the need to be heard before they too disappeared. In Israel, founded in 1948, the survivors became both symbols of tragedy and resilience. Many joined the fight for independence, channeling their pain into a new purpose. In Germany, Austria, and Poland, memorials began to rise where camps once stood. But for decades, the full horror of the Holocaust remained almost too large for the world to face. The liberators aged and died. The survivors grew older, their numbers thinning, their voices growing faint. But their testimonies remained, a living bridge between memory and history. Liberation, in the truest sense, did not come with the opening of gates. It came the years and decades that followed, as survivors learned how to live again, how to laugh, how to love. It came in the moments when they taught their children not to hate, when they wrote books and built museums, when they turned trauma into testimony. They carried their ghosts with them, but they also carried something stronger, the belief that remembering was a form of resistance. For the soldiers who liberated the camps, the images never faded. Many cannot speak of it for years. Some turned to drink, others to silence. "We thought we were fighting a war," one American soldier said. "We didn't know we were fighting to save humanity from itself." For them, liberation was a wound as well, a glimpse into what humans could do when conscience failed. They, too, became witnesses, their memories passed down like torches to the generations that would come after. In time, the word liberation would come to symbolize more than the opening of gates. It meant the restoration of truth in a world built on lies. It meant the triumph of human dignity over systematic dehumanization. It meant that even in the face of complete destruction, something within humanity had survived, something unkillable, something that refused to die. Today, when visitors walk through Auschwitz, Dachau, or Belsen, they follow the same paths the liberators once walked. The air is quiet, the wind cold. The fences remain, the watchtowers still standing. But the silence is different now. It is not the silence of fear or death. It is the silence of remembrance. Flowers grow where bodies once lay. Children visit with their parents, listening to guides speak softly about what happened here. They see the piles of shoes, the barracks, the rail tracks. They do not understand fully, but they feel the weight of it. And perhaps that is enough for now. Liberation was not a single moment. It was a process, a long, painful journey from darkness into fragile light. It was the slow rediscovery of trust, the rebuilding of families, the search for faith after the loss of everything sacred. It was the moment when the survivors looked at the sunrise and realized they were still alive, and that survival itself was an act of defiance. The world had changed forever. The camps were gone, but their shadows stretched across generations. The liberators returned home as heroes, but inside, they carried memories they could not describe. The survivors rebuilt, but in their silence lived an unspoken truth, that freedom is never truly free, and that the cost of forgetting is always the beginning of repetition. When the last survivor takes their final breath, when the last liberator lays down their rifle, the responsibility will pass entirely to us, to remember, to speak, to warn. Liberation will mean nothing if the memory fades. The gates of Auschwitz were opened once by soldiers. It is up to humanity to keep them from ever closing again. That is the meaning of liberation, not the end of horror, but the promise that the world would never again look away. A promise written not in treaties or speeches, but in ashes, in memory, and in the eyes of those who walked out of the camps, free at last, into a world that would never again be the same. Chapter 13. The Trials and the Reckoning. The courtroom in Nuremberg was cold that winter morning in November 1945. Outside, the city lay in ruins, its streets filled with the rubble of a fallen empire. Inside, under the carved wooden crest of an eagle now stripped of its swastika, the victors of the war had gathered not to conquer, but to judge. 22 men sat in the dock, once generals, ministers, and architects of the Third Reich, now stripped of rank and surrounded by soldiers with loaded rifles. The air was thick with tension and the smell of wet stone. For the first time in human history, a nation's leaders would be held accountable not just for losing a war, but for crimes against humanity itself. The world had never seen anything like it. When the judges entered, the room fell silent. Among the defendants were men whose names had been whispered with terror across continents. Hermann Göring, Hitler's chosen successor, Joachim von Ribbentrop, the foreign minister, Wilhelm Keitel, the head of the army, and Rudolf Hess, Hitler's deputy. Some sat stone-faced, others scribbled notes, but most looked smaller than their legends. Ordinary men behind glass, dwarfed by the enormity of their crimes. They had once commanded millions. Now they waited for the verdict of humanity. The Nuremberg Trials were more than prosecution. They were a confrontation with the darkest truths of modern civilization. The Allied powers, the United States, the Soviet Union, Great Britain, and France, had agreed that the crimes of Nazi Germany could not simply be buried under rubble or vengeance. They had to be exposed, documented, judged. The evidence would be the dead themselves, their ashes, their bones, and their testimonies from the edge of hell. For months, prosecutors assembled mountains of proof, films, photographs, orders, diaries, and the very documents the Nazis had once written in their meticulous bureaucratic precision. Every atrocity had been recorded, every shipment logged, every death counted. The Germans had left a paper trail of murder. Now, that trail will be followed to its end. As the trials began, the chief prosecutor, Robert H. Jackson of the United States, addressed the court. His words still echo through history. The wrongs which we seek to condemn and punish, he said, have been so calculated, so malignant, and so devastating that civilization cannot tolerate their being ignored, because it cannot survive their being repeated. The courtroom was silent, except for the scratching of pens. The world was being forced to look at itself. The evidence unfolded like a horror without end. Films taken by Allied soldiers at the liberation of the camps were projected on a screen. The defendants turned their eyes away as the images flickered. Piles of bodies, children with hollow eyes, the skeletal remains of Auschwitz and Belsen. The footage was silent, but in the courtroom, it screamed. Witnesses took the stand, survivors who had seen their families murdered, doctors who had been forced to assist in experiments, officers who had turned on their comrades. They spoke in calm voices, but their words struck like thunder. One man described the transports to Treblinka. Another recounted the gas chambers at Chelmno. The judges sat in stunned stillness. Even the translators hesitated, their voices trembling as they repeated the words. The defendants responded with denial, arrogance, or deflection. Göring, the most defiant, argued that he had only followed orders from his Führer and that the victors were guilty of hypocrisy for judging him. If you had won, he sneered at the prosecutors, you would not be sitting there so smugly. His confidence masked fear, but it could not hide guilt. Others claimed ignorance. I did not know, said Ribbentrop. I never saw the camps, said Keitel. The excuse echoed over and over. I was following orders. Yet the documents told a different story. Memos signed in their own handwriting, speeches calling for extermination, orders approving deportations, all stood as evidence against them. Paper, ink, and signature became the final witnesses of their crimes. For the survivors who sat in the gallery, the trials were a strange mix of justice and despair. Justice, because the world had finally recognized their suffering. Despair, because nothing could restore what had been taken. The courtroom was a theater of morality, but outside its walls, Europe still reeked of ashes. Millions were still displaced, their families gone, their homes erased. The trials could punish the guilty, but they could not resurrect the dead. Yet the survivors watched, not for revenge, but for truth. They wanted the world to know that this had happened, that it was real, and that those who had done it could not hide behind flags or orders. The proceedings lasted 10 months. Each defendant faced charges of war crimes, crimes against peace, and crimes against humanity. The phrase crimes against humanity had never been used in a court before. It was a new concept, born from the ruins of the Holocaust, a recognition that some acts were so monstrous they transcended national law. The idea that individuals, not just governments, could be held accountable for atrocities would change international law forever. When the verdicts were read on October 1st, 1946, the air in the courtroom was electric. 12 men were sentenced to death by hanging, including Göring, Ribbentrop, Keitel, and Kaltenbrunner. 3 received life sentences, and 4 others lesser terms. 3 were acquitted, a decision that left many uneasy. As the sentences were announced, Göring smirked, pretending indifference. But the mask cracked days later when he swallowed a cyanide capsule in his cell, cheating the hangman. The others were executed in the early hours of October 16th. Their bodies were cremated, their ashes scattered in the Isar River, ensuring no grave would ever serve as a shrine. But Nuremberg was not the end. It was only the beginning. Thousands of smaller trials followed across Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and beyond. Camp commandants, SS doctors, and guards were hunted, tried, and punished. At the Dachau trials, American military courts convicted hundreds of perpetrators. In Poland, the Auschwitz trials brought men like Rudolf Haas, the camp commandant, to justice. Haas, who had once described his work as a duty, stood before the court and admitted to supervising the murder of more than 1 million people. His voice was flat, mechanical, devoid of emotion. When asked if he felt remorse, he said only, "I was obeying orders." He was hanged on a gallows erected beside the ruins of Auschwitz, the camp he had commanded. Still, many escaped. Some fled to South America, aided by secret networks that smuggled war criminals across borders. Among them was Adolf Eichmann, the mastermind of the deportations, who vanished into Argentina under a false name. For 15 years, he lived quietly, until Israeli agents found and captured him in 1960. His trial in Jerusalem brought the Holocaust back to the forefront of global consciousness. Unlike Nuremberg, where the defendants were part of a group, Eichmann faced his crimes alone. The courtroom was filled with survivors, journalists, and television cameras. The world watched as he sat behind bulletproof glass, expressionless, while witnesses recounted how he had sent millions to their deaths. When asked about his role, he said, "I was merely a small cog in a vast machine." The prosecutor replied, "No, Mr. Eichmann, you were the engineer." He was convicted and hanged in 1962, his ashes scattered at sea so that no soil would hold him. Other Nazis, like Joseph Mengele, the Angel of Death, escaped justice entirely. Mengele fled to South America, moving between Argentina, Paraguay, and Brazil, living under false names. He drowned in 1979, never facing a trial. His unpunished life became a symbol of the incomplete justice of the post-war years, a reminder that evil often outlives accountability. In Germany itself, the reckoning was uneven. Many ordinary citizens who had participated in or profited from the Nazi system quietly reintegrated into society. Judges, police officers, and bureaucrats resumed their positions in the new West German government. Denazification programs, meant to purge Nazi influence, were often superficial. The Cold War shifted priorities. The Allies needed Germany as an ally against the Soviet Union, and the pursuit of justice gave way to political pragmatism. For survivors, it felt like betrayal. The world had judged the architects of evil, but allowed its builders to walk free. Yet, amid this moral fog, something deeper began to take root. A slow awakening, a collective confrontation with guilt and memory. In Germany's schools and universities, young people began to ask questions their parents refused to answer. Photographs of the camps were displayed, documentaries shown, and the word Vergangenheitsbewältigung, coming to terms with the past, entered the national vocabulary. It was not forgiveness, but a reckoning with truth. In Israel, the survivors became storytellers and teachers. They spoke in classrooms, museums, and synagogues, keeping alive the memory of those who had no voice. Their testimonies, recorded on film and in books, became living evidence long after the last trials ended. The reckoning had shifted from courts to conscience, from punishment to remembrance. The legacy of Nuremberg reshaped the world. It laid the foundation for international law, for the Geneva Conventions, for the concept that just following orders is not a defense. It gave birth to institutions like the International Criminal Court, created decades later to prosecute war crimes in Rwanda, Yugoslavia, and beyond. Every modern trial for genocide carries the shadow of Nuremberg. The courtroom in that ruined German city became the birthplace of accountability itself. But even as justice was written into law, it was not written into hearts. In the years after the war, denial began to fester. Some claimed the Holocaust was exaggerated, others that it was a fabrication. Books appeared questioning the gas chambers, the numbers, the testimonies. For survivors, it was a second wound, a war against memory. The truth had to be defended again, not in courtrooms, but in classrooms, museums, and public debate. The reckoning had never ended. It had only changed shape. When asked years later why Nuremberg mattered, one prosecutor said, "We were not just trying men. We were trying an idea. The idea that one race could claim the right to rule, enslave, or destroy another. That idea had nearly destroyed the world. The trials had not erased it, but they had drawn a line in history. Beyond this, humanity cannot go and remain human." In the ruins of Nuremberg today, the courthouse still stands. Visitors walk through the chamber where the trials took place, now a museum. The wooden benches remain, the microphones, the dock where Göring once sat. The air is quiet, reverent. Outside, the city has rebuilt, its streets alive again. But inside that room, time feels frozen. The ghosts of the accused still linger, and so do the voices of the witnesses. It is a reminder that justice, once found, must be guarded forever. The reckoning of the Holocaust was not only about punishment. It was about truth. It was about forcing the world to confront what it had allowed to happen and to understand that civilization itself is fragile. The trials did not heal the wounds, but they ensured the scars would be seen. They proved that even after the darkest night, humanity could still look at itself and say, "Never again." Yet, never again is not a promise kept by words alone. It requires vigilance, empathy, and the courage to confront hatred wherever it rises. The reckoning that began in Nuremberg was not confined to those who sat in judgment. It belongs to all who inherit the world they left behind. And so, as the years pass and the witnesses fade, their echoes remain. The courtroom grows quiet, the benches gather dust, but the question endures: will we remember, and will we act when history begins to rhyme again? The reckoning was not finished in 1946. It is still being written. Every time we choose justice over silence, truth over convenience, humanity over indifference. That is the final legacy of Nuremberg. Not the verdicts, not the hangings, but the reminder that memory itself is the only true judgment that lasts. Chapter 14. The Weight of Memory. The candles flickered in the cool night air, their tiny flames trembling like fragile souls refusing to be extinguished. It was years after the guns had fallen silent. Yet for those who gathered beneath the stars, silence was still heavy with ghosts. Survivors stood in a circle, their faces illuminated by the glow, their eyes reflecting both grief and defiance. They spoke the names of the dead softly, like prayers carried into eternity. Each name was a world lost, each whisper a rebellion against forgetting. The war was over, but the battle for memory had only begun. In the ruins of Europe, memory was not something people wanted to hold. Cities had been rebuilt, streets renamed, graves covered with flowers, but beneath the surface, the past still throbbed like an old wound. Many wanted to move on, to bury the horror, to rebuild normal lives. But others knew that silence was dangerous. They had seen what silence could do. It had built the gas chambers, fueled the trains, and allowed neighbors to vanish without a word. Forgetting, they feared, would be the final victory of the Nazis. So they began to remember, not just in grief, but in warning. For survivors, remembering was not a choice. It was a compulsion, a duty. The memories invaded their dreams and shaped their waking lives. Some could not speak of it for decades, their trauma buried beneath the need to appear normal. Others began to talk immediately, telling their stories again and again to anyone who would listen. In small apartments, in cafes and refugee centers, they spoke, haltingly, painfully, about hunger, about loss, about the nights when the sky itself seemed to burn. They told of mothers torn from their children, of brothers shot beside them, of prayers whispered in barracks that smelled of death. And when words failed, they wrote. Diaries, poems, letters, fragments of a shattered world, committed to paper before time could erase them. The world, at first, did not want to hear. The post-war years were full of other noise, political struggles, reconstruction, the new tension between East and West. The Cold War demanded new enemies, not reflection. In Germany, many turned away, unwilling to face what their nation had done. In other countries, people spoke of victory and liberation, not genocide. The Holocaust, as it would later be called, was too vast, too monstrous, too uncomfortable to look at directly. It lived in whispers and survivor gatherings, but not yet in the heart of collective consciousness. And yet, the past has a way of insisting on itself. In 1953, Israel established Yad Vashem, the memorial to the 6 million Jews murdered in the Holocaust. The name meant a memorial and a name, taken from the book of Isaiah. I will give them in my house, and within my walls a memorial and a name that shall not be cut off. The memorial was more than stone and steel. It was a promise, a declaration that every lost soul would be remembered. The survivors who had built new lives in Israel, America, and Europe began to write their testimonies formally, determined that the world would never again say, "We did not know." In Germany, the weight of memory took longer to settle. For years, many Germans called themselves victims too, of bombings, of occupation, of fate. Few spoke of complicity. It was not until the 1960s that the second generation began to ask questions their parents refused to answer. Students demanded to know what their fathers had done during the war. Teachers faced classrooms where the children of perpetrators asked, "Where were you when the trains left?" It was uncomfortable, painful, necessary. Through these questions, a nation began to see its reflection for the first time, and it was not a pleasant sight. In the same decade, a trial in Frankfurt reignited the conversation. Former guards and officials from Auschwitz were brought to court. Survivors testified, their voices shaking but unwavering. One woman described her first night in the camp. Another spoke of her child taken from her arms. The defendants sat pale and silent, as the words stripped away decades of denial. For young Germans watching on television, it was their first real encounter with the crimes committed in their parents' names. The courtroom became a classroom, and for the first time, the Holocaust was no longer a story of others. It was their inheritance. As survivors aged, their memories became history, their testimonies sacred texts of humanity's darkest lesson. Writers and filmmakers began to translate their pain into art. Elie Wiesel's Night, Primo Levi's If This Is a Man, and in Frank's diary became voices for those who could no longer speak. Each word carried the echo of millions, each story a window into the abyss. Through them, the world began to understand, not statistics, but the unbearable intimacy of loss. The Holocaust was no longer a distant horror. It was a mirror held up to civilization itself. But memory is not static. It shifts with time, reshaped by the generations that inherit it. For the children of survivors, known as the second generation, memory was both burden and identity. They grew up in households haunted by silences and sudden bursts of grief. A broken plate could trigger tears. A siren could cause panic. Many never knew their grandparents or uncles, but they felt their absence like a missing limb. Some devoted their lives to preserving their parents' stories. Others fled from them, unable to carry the weight. The Holocaust had ended, but its echoes lived on in bloodlines, passed down like a scar written into DNA. Meanwhile, the world began to build monuments, not only in memory of the dead, but as anchors for the living. In Poland, the ruins of Auschwitz were preserved exactly as the liberators had found them. The barbed wire, the barracks, the piles of shoes and glasses. In Paris, Berlin, and Washington, museums rose with glass, steel, and stone designed to evoke both remembrance and unease. Each was a question carved into architecture. How could this have happened? And could it happen again? Visitors walked through corridors lined with photographs of smiling families, unaware that each face was a ghost. They left in silence, changed, their reflections in the glass mingling with those of the dead. Yet as time moved on, the danger shifted. The survivors began to die, their voices fading one by one. Each passing year brought fewer first-hand witnesses. Historians and educators warned of the coming post-witness era, when the last living testimony would fall silent. What would happen, they asked, when memory became only history? Would the world still feel its weight? Or would it become just another chapter in a textbook, flattened by distance? To combat this, survivors recorded thousands of hours of video testimony, captured by institutions like the USC Shoah Foundation. They sat before cameras, their faces lined with age, their voices breaking, but their eyes still fierce. "You must tell it," they said, "because soon we won't be here to." But as the witnesses spoke, others began to deny. Holocaust denial spread like a poison in the shadows. Books, pamphlets, speeches claiming it had all been exaggerated or fabricated. It was more than ignorance. It was hatred dressed as skepticism. For survivors, it was a second death. The same world that had looked away while they burned now began to question whether the fire had ever existed. Governments passed laws against denial, but laws could not cure disbelief. Education became the only weapon. Teachers brought testimonies into classrooms, showing students not just numbers, but faces, not just words, but voices. Memory became resistance. In Germany, the very heart of remembrance transformed. Berlin erected the memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe, a vast field of gray, concrete slabs rising and falling like waves of grief. There were no names, no explanations, only silence. People wandered through, lost among the blocks, dwarfed by their immensity. Some found peace there. Others found unease. That was the point. Memory was not meant to comfort. It was meant to confront. As decades passed, remembrance took on new forms. Marches of the Living brought students from around the world to Auschwitz, walking the path from the camp's gates to the ruins of Birkenau. They carried Israeli flags, photographs of victims, and the weight of history on their young shoulders. They sang songs of defiance, their voices echoing where once there had been only screams. The march was not only for the dead. It was for the living, a declaration that life had returned to the place built for death. For many survivors, the ultimate act of memory was forgiveness, not for the perpetrators, but for themselves. They had carried guilt their entire lives, guilt for surviving when so many did not. They called it the survivor's burden, the feeling that every breath stolen from death had been borrowed. In their final years, many came to peace with it. They told their grandchildren, "You are the answer to Hitler." Every wedding, every child, every song sung in freedom was defiance. The Holocaust had sought to erase them. Their existence was a reply. But memory is fragile. With each passing generation, the Holocaust risks fading from lived experience to distant history. For young people born in peace, the images are ancient black and white ghosts, the camp's faraway ruins. The danger is not only denial, it is indifference. When horror becomes routine, its warning loses power. The survivors knew this. That is why they spoke again and again, even when it hurt, even when it tore open old wounds. They spoke because silence had built the gas chambers, and they would not allow silence to build them again. Today, the weight of memory rests on us. Every photograph we see, every testimony we hear, is a piece of that burden handed down. The candles still flicker, the stones still bear names, but it is not enough to remember passively. Memory is not a museum. It is a mirror. It demands reflection, empathy, and courage. It asks whether we see ourselves in the faces of the victims, and whether we recognize the potential for cruelty that lives in us all. The Holocaust was not only a crime of monsters. It was a crime of neighbors, teachers, clerks, and soldiers, ordinary people who looked away, obeyed orders, or convinced themselves that silence was innocence. Remembering means facing that truth, not hiding from it. It means understanding that evil does not begin with fire or gas, but with words, with propaganda, with the slow erosion of empathy. In every generation, there will be those who want to forget. They will say it is time to move on, that the past is too heavy. But history has shown what happens when memory fades. Hatred returns wearing new uniforms, speaking new languages, but whispering the same lies. The weight of memory is not a burden to be shed. It is a responsibility to be carried. And so the candles still burn. In synagogues, in classrooms, on Memorial Days when the sirens wail and traffic stops. For 2 minutes, the world stands still, and the ghosts of 6 million rise in the silence. They do not ask for tears. They ask for vigilance. They ask that we never again allow the unthinkable to become ordinary. The weight of memory is heavy because it carries the dead, but it also carries hope. The hope that by remembering, we keep humanity awake. And as long as those candles burn, as long as one voice tells the story, the darkness will never again have the final word. Chapter 15. Never again. The sky above Auschwitz is quiet now. The birds return in spring, the grass grows between the rails, and the wind carries no screams, only the faint whisper of history. But as tourists walk through the gates that still read Arbeit mocked free, some feel something they can't quite name. It's not fear, not exactly. It's the sense of standing in a place where humanity ended and memory began. The silence feels alive, as if the air itself remembers. Every stone, every rusted fence, every shoe behind glass still speaks in its own language. This happened, and it could happen again. When the war ended, people around the world said those 2 words, never again. They said them in speeches, in prayers, in disbelief. They said them because they needed to believe that such horror could never return. But history, cruel and unrelenting, has a way of testing promises. To say never again is easy. To live it requires eternal vigilance. It demands that memory become action. The Holocaust did not begin with gas chambers. It began with words, with hate whispered in cafes, shouted in parliaments, printed in newspapers. It began with jokes that dehumanized, laws that excluded, and silence from those who knew better. The machinery of genocide was built on ordinary cowardice and bureaucratic obedience long before it was powered by trains and bullets. To say never again means recognizing that genocide grows not from madness but from apathy, from the slow acceptance of cruelty as normal. After the war, the nations of the world tried to build something new from the ashes. In 1948, the United Nations adopted the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, the first legal definition of that word. Genocide, coined by Raphael Lemkin, a Polish Jewish lawyer who had lost his family in the Holocaust. He spent years arguing that what had happened was not just murder, but the destruction of an entire people. He wrote that genocide was a crime against the existence of human groups. His voice was lonely at first, drowned by politics and exhaustion, but his persistence turned grief into law. That same year, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was signed in Paris. It began with simple, defiant words. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. The world was still bleeding, still haunted, but those words were a promise written into history, a promise that humanity would protect itself from itself. The declaration was not just about the past. It was a blueprint for the future, a vow to recognize the value of every life. But even as the ink dried, the promise began to falter. In the decades that followed, never again echoed across new killing fields. Cambodia, Rwanda, Bosnia, Darfur, Syria. Different flags, different languages, the same silence. The world watched again as neighbors turned on neighbors, as children were starved, as bodies filled rivers. The mechanisms were smaller, the technology newer, but the pattern was old. People asked, how could this happen again? But the truth was that it had never really stopped happening. It had only changed shape. The Holocaust had taught the world the blueprint of genocide, and some had studied it well. Yet something was different too. Each new atrocity was met by the memory of the last. Survivors of the Holocaust became witnesses not only for their own suffering, but for all who faced extermination. They spoke out when others were silent. When the massacres began in Rwanda, it was Jewish survivors who were among the first to call it by its name. Genocide, before governments dared to. Their pain had become prophecy. They understood that never again meant for anyone. In Israel, the Holocaust became a cornerstone of identity, a scar and a shield. The survivors who had rebuilt their lives there carried the lessons of the camps into the new nation's soul. Every siren on Holocaust Remembrance Day still halts the country in silence. Traffic stops, conversations end, and for 2 minutes, the living remember the dead. The wail of that siren is not just grief, it is defiance. It says, we remember, we are here. But even in Israel, the lessons of the past are complex. The struggle to defend one's existence can blur into the temptation to see others through the same lens of fear. History, if unexamined, can harden into armor. The danger of remembering only as victims is forgetting that others can suffer too. In Germany, the weight of never again became the foundation of a moral rebirth. The country rebuilt itself not by denying its crimes, but by facing them. Memorials rose in city centers, reminders that the past could not be erased. German students still visit concentration camps as part of their education, standing in the same rooms where their ancestors once killed or died. The act of remembering became an act of national conscience, a way to prove that remembrance could be a kind of redemption. And yet, even there, shadows linger. In recent years, new voices of hate have risen, testing the boundaries of memory. Neo-Nazis march in the streets. Antisemitism hides behind politics. The past knocks again, softly but persistently, reminding the world that forgetting is always waiting. The meaning of never again also lives in the survivors' faces. Those who lived long enough to watch the world change, to watch their children and grandchildren grow in freedom. In their wrinkles are stories not of despair, but of endurance. Many have said that revenge was not their way. Their revenge was survival. Their victory was life itself. Each birthday, each grandchild born, was an act of defiance against Hitler's dream. One survivor once said, "He wanted a world without us. Every morning I wake up, I prove him wrong." But as the survivors fade, their absence becomes a new kind of test. What happens when the last voice falls silent? When there is no trembling witness to look a denier in the eye and say, "I was there"? In this post-witness era, memory depends on faith. The faith that stories can live without storytellers, that photographs can still speak, that truth can survive without those who lived it. Museums and archives have tried to preserve everything. The recordings, the diaries, the testimonies. But the emotional bridge between generations grows thinner each year. For young people today, the Holocaust is as far away as ancient wars once were. And that distance is dangerous, because apathy grows in the space between memory and belief. Never again is not just a slogan, it's a warning system. It tells us what happens when democracy collapses, when propaganda replaces truth, when fear turns into policy. The warning signs are always the same: a scapegoat, a dehumanized other, a narrative of purity, and a population too weary or indifferent to resist. It never begins with camps. It begins with indifference. That is why remembrance must live not only in museums, but in daily vigilance. The Holocaust teaches us that evil is not a foreign invader. It grows from within. Across the world, memorials stand as physical embodiments of this promise. In Washington, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum bears an inscription from Deuteronomy: "Only guard yourself and guard your soul carefully, lest you forget the things your eyes saw." In Berlin, concrete slabs stretch across an entire city block, uneven and disorienting, forcing visitors to feel small and lost. In Poland, the ruins of Birkenau remain untouched, the train tracks still leading to nothingness. Each site, each monument, is a fragment of the vow that the world made, to remember so that it does not repeat. But memory alone is not enough. To say never again is to act whenever humanity is threatened. It is to see the same shadows in different places and to call them by their name. For decades, survivors warned that history could repeat if people forgot how easily it began. Their warnings feel prophetic now. Around the world, nationalism rises again. Hate once whispered returns in slogans. The language of exclusion returns in new forms, on screens instead of newspapers, but with the same venom. Refugees are called invaders, minorities are painted as threats, and conspiracy theories replace truth. The tools have changed, but the pattern remains. The Holocaust does not live only in the past. It lives in every echo of dehumanization today. And yet, there is hope in how the world remembers. The children and grandchildren of survivors have taken up the torch. They write, teach, and tell the stories their ancestors could barely speak. Some are artists, some are historians, some are ordinary people who refuse to let the silence win. They build bridges with other victims of violence, standing beside survivors of Rwanda, Bosnia, and Syria, saying, "Your story is ours too." This is what never again truly means, not isolation and memory, but solidarity through it. The Holocaust is not just a Jewish tragedy, it is a human one. Its lesson belongs to all who believe that the dignity of one life cannot be measured against another. In schools around the world, students now read in Frank's diary and Elie Wiesel's Night. They walk through memorials and watch films that make them cry. They learn that history is not about dates and numbers. It's about choices. The choice to speak or stay silent, to follow or to resist, to see others as human or not. Never again is not a shield that protects us from the past. It is a mirror that reflects the future. One of the last survivors once said in an interview, "The Holocaust did not begin with gas chambers. It began when words lost their meaning, when truth became whatever the powerful said it was." Those words feel heavier now than ever. In an age of misinformation, when lies spread faster than truth, the lesson of the Holocaust becomes urgent again. When truth dies, so does humanity. Never again must mean defending truth itself. And still, the world struggles. New genocides unfold while leaders debate definitions. The same phrases are heard. "We didn't know. It's complicated. It's not our concern." The same excuses that once paved the road to Auschwitz still echo. That is why never again must not be a whisper spoken once a year on Memorial Days. It must be a cry that drowns out indifference every time injustice begins to rise. As twilight falls over Auschwitz, the sky deepens to violet, and the first stars appear. The air grows cold. Somewhere, a guide's voice fades into silence, and a visitor lingers by the barbed wire, staring at the distance. They can almost imagine the trains, the cries, the smoke. They close their eyes and whisper, "Never again." The words dissolve into the wind, joining millions of others who have said them before. And though history has failed that promise again and again, the words still matter. Because every generation must make them new. Never again is not a guarantee. It's a responsibility. It is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of vigilance. It demands that we recognize the small signs before they grow large, that we speak when it is still safe to speak, that we see ourselves not as bystanders to history, but as its authors. In the end, perhaps never again is not a promise to the dead, but a warning to the living. The world cannot undo what was done, but it can choose how it remembers, how it responds, how it stands against the shadows that always return. The survivors are almost gone now, their stories recorded, their faces fading into photographs. But the duty they carried is ours now. Their voices are our conscience. Their memory is our mirror. And so, the candles still burn. In homes, in synagogues, in classrooms, their flames flicker in defiance of darkness. The shadows of the past lean close, but the light endures. Each flame says what words cannot. We remember, we resist, we remain. Never again is not a prayer for safety. It is a call to action. It is the voice of history, whispering to the living. The moment you stop remembering, it begins again.